Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Think about that quietly, let the question settle, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the story. The city breathes differently after midnight. The pulse that drives the daylight hours, the rush of footsteps, the hum of traffic, the constant chatter of a million conversations, fades into something deeper, more fundamental. What remains is the true heartbeat of the place, slow and steady, like the rhythm of someone deep in sleep. In the municipal building on 5th Street, 3 floors above the empty lobby with its worn marble floors. Detective Sarah Chun sits at her desk, surrounded by the quiet architecture of investigation. The overhead fluorescent lights have been dimmed to their lowest setting, casting everything in a soft, amber glow that makes the stacks of manila folders seem almost golden in the half-light. The building itself is old. Constructed in 1952, when the city was smaller and the crimes were different. The walls are thick concrete, painted in that particular shade of institutional green that was popular decades ago and never changed. During the day, these walls absorb the sound of ringing phones, hurried conversations, and the constant shuffle of paperwork. But at night, they seem to exhale all that stored sound as a gentle whisper. Like the building itself is settling into rest, Chun moves through her work with the practiced rhythm of someone who has done this thousands of times before. Each case file represents hours of careful documentation. Witness statements typed on forms that have barely changed in 20 years. Photographs clipped to reports with small metal fasteners that leave tiny rust stains around the edges. The files pile up in neat stacks according to their own internal logic, sorted by date, by severity, by the alphabet of surnames that will never be famous but are recorded here, with the same care as any historical document. The first file she opens tonight is marked with a date from 6 months ago. Inside, the papers are crisp and white, the ink still dark and clear. A simple case, really a break-in at a corner market on Elm Street, reported by the owner when he arrived to open the next morning. The report describes how the front window had been carefully removed, not shattered, suggesting someone who took their time and worked quietly in the deep hours. When the street was empty, the investigating officer had noted the absence of fingerprints on the window frame. The way the cash register had been opened with a key rather than forced, indicating the perpetrator had patience and perhaps experience. What struck Chun as she read was not the crime itself, but the thoroughness of the documentation. Every detail had been preserved. The weather that night was clear and cold. The streetlight outside the market had been functioning normally. The alarm system had been disabled from the inside using knowledge of the 4-digit code. These details paint a picture not just of the crime, but of the neighborhood itself. Elm Street is the kind of place where people know each other, where the market owner probably gave the alarm code to a trusted employee or family member years ago, and never thought to change it. It's a street where serious crime is rare enough that a simple break-in becomes noteworthy, where the investigating officer took the time to interview not just the owner, but 3 neighboring businesses, all of whom reported nothing unusual. That night, Chun sets the file aside and reaches for another. This one is older, from nearly 2 years ago, and the papers have already begun to show the first signs of age. The edges are slightly yellowed, and there's a coffee ring on the back of the cover where someone once set down a mug without thinking. Inside, the story of a missing person case unfolds in the measured language of official reports. Margaret Holloway, age 67, had been reported missing by her daughter when she failed to show up for their weekly lunch appointment. The initial report describes a woman of regular habits: daily walks at 7 in the morning, grocery shopping every Tuesday, library visits on Friday afternoons. Her apartment showed no signs of disturbance. Her car was still in the parking garage beneath her building, and her purse with credit cards and identification was found on the kitchen counter. Investigation had been thorough, but yielded little. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed Mrs. Holloway leaving her building for her morning walk, following her usual route through Meridian Park and along the river path. The cameras tracked her progress for 6 blocks before she moved beyond their range, walking at her normal pace, stopping to pet a neighbor's dog as she did every morning. What the file doesn't contain is as significant as what it does. There are no follow-up reports indicating Mrs. Holloway had been found. No updates suggesting she had contacted family members or used her credit cards. The case simply exists in this folder, complete and incomplete at the same time, waiting in the quiet of the filing cabinet for some resolution that may never come. Chun finds herself thinking about Mrs. Holloway's daily walks, how they had become such a fixture of the neighborhood. Routine that several witnesses were able to provide precise times and locations. There's something both comforting and melancholy about such regularity, the way a single person's habits can become part of the larger rhythm of a place. The morning dog owner who looked forward to Mrs. Holloway's visit, the coffee shop where she occasionally stopped for tea, the park bench where she would sit for exactly 10 minutes before continuing home. The night shift brings its own particular quality of concentration. Without the interruptions of phone calls and meetings, without the constant flow of new cases and urgent matters, there's space to sit with these stories and let them settle. Chun has learned that some understanding comes only in stillness, when the mind has time to notice the patterns and connections that remain invisible during the busy hours. She opens a third file, this one thick with supplementary reports and witness statements. A hit-and-run case from last spring, investigated with the kind of meticulous attention that major crimes receive. The victim had been crossing Park Avenue at the designated crosswalk, following all traffic signals, when a dark sedan ran the red light and struck them before speeding away into the night. The investigation had consumed weeks. Officers canvassed every auto body shop within 50 miles, looking for vehicles with front-end damage. They reviewed traffic camera footage from dozens of intersections, tracking possible routes the suspect vehicle might have taken. They interviewed witnesses multiple times, trying to extract every possible detail about the car's make, model, and license plate. What emerges from reading these reports is not just the story of the crime, but a portrait of how thoroughly modern life is documented. Every intersection has its cameras. Every cell phone tower keeps records of which devices were in the area at what times. Every business has security systems that capture fragments of the street beyond their doors. The investigation produced hundreds of pages of evidence, all of it carefully organized and cross-referenced, creating a comprehensive map of everything that happened in that neighborhood during the relevant 20-minute window. Yet despite all this documentation, the case remains unsolved. The dark sedan disappeared into the network of city streets and highways, its driver unidentified, its license plate obscured by distance and shadow. The file contains detailed drawings of tire marks, measurements of skid marks, analysis of paint chips found at the scene. It represents hundreds of hours of careful police work, all preserved in neat chronological order. Waiting, Chun moves to the filing cabinet to retrieve more folders. The cabinet itself is a monument to bureaucratic persistence, 5 feet tall and painted the same institutional green as the walls. Each drawer slides open with a soft whisper of metal on metal, revealing rows of folders organized by case number and date. The system has been in place for decades, surviving multiple updates to computer databases and digital records management. These physical files remain the authoritative record, the place where original documents and evidence are preserved. The fourth file she selects tells the story of a burglary that occurred in one of the city's older residential neighborhoods, where large houses sit back from the street, behind mature trees and well-maintained lawns. The crime had been discovered when the homeowners returned from a 2-week vacation to find their front door standing slightly ajar and several rooms ransacked. The burglar had been methodical and selective. Electronics were missing: television, computer, tablets, but expensive artwork remained untouched on the walls. Jewelry had been taken from the master bedroom, but family photographs and personal documents were left undisturbed. The investigating officer noted that the intruder seemed to understand the difference between items with resale value and those with only sentimental worth. What made this case particularly interesting was the evidence that the burglar had spent considerable time in the house. Dishes in the kitchen sink suggested they had prepared and eaten a meal. The television in the den had been left on, tuned to a local news channel. A book from the homeowner's library was found open on the coffee table, bookmarked halfway through with a grocery store receipt. These details suggest not just theft, but a kind of temporary residence. The burglar had made themselves at home in someone else's space, living briefly in a life that wasn't theirs. There's something almost philosophical about such behavior, the way it blurs the boundaries between crime and domestic routine. Chun wonders what the burglar thought about while sitting in a stranger's living room, eating food from their refrigerator, reading their books. The investigation had been routine but thorough. Fingerprints were collected from various surfaces, though none matched any records in the database. Neighbors were interviewed, revealing that no one had noticed anything unusual during the 2-week period. The house had continued to look lived in, with automatic timers controlling the lights and lawn sprinklers maintaining the appearance of normal activity. This attention to maintaining appearances suggests a degree of planning and observation that goes beyond opportunistic crime. The burglar had watched the house long enough to understand the family's routines, to know when they would be away and for how long. They had taken the time to study the automated systems that simulated occupancy, working around them rather than being deterred by them. Chun sets this file aside and reaches for another, older folder that feels substantial in her hands. Inside, she finds the documentation of a fraud case that had unfolded over several months 2 years ago. An elderly man had been receiving phone calls from someone claiming to represent his bank, requesting verification of account information to update security protocols. The caller had been patient and professional, building trust over multiple conversations before finally obtaining enough information to access the victim's savings account. The financial investigation had revealed a sophisticated operation. The stolen funds had been moved through multiple accounts, each transaction carefully structured to avoid automatic fraud detection systems. The money had been withdrawn from ATMs across 3 different states, always in amounts small enough to escape notice. Always from machines located in busy areas where surveillance cameras would capture only crowds of anonymous faces. What struck the investigating officers was not just the technical sophistication of the scheme, but the psychological manipulation involved. The fraudster had researched their victim carefully, learning enough about his banking history and personal life to seem genuinely concerned about his financial security. They had called at times when elderly people are often lonely and grateful for conversation, building a relationship over weeks before making their request for sensitive information. The case file includes transcripts of the victim's interviews with investigators, his voice preserved in the careful language of official reports. He described how natural the conversations had felt, how the caller had seemed to know exactly which bank he used, and even mentioned specific transactions from his recent statements. The fraudster had done their homework, creating a convincing performance that exploited trust rather than fear. Despite months of investigation, tracking the money through its complex path from account to account, the perpetrator was never identified. The case remains open, not because new leads are expected, but because closure requires more than just documenting what happened. Someone somewhere had studied this elderly man's life carefully enough to deceive him convincingly, and then disappeared back into the anonymous networks of electronic banking and interstate commerce. Chun pauses in her reading to listen to the sounds of the building at night. 3 floors below, she can hear the faint hum of the overnight security guard's radio. occasionally crackling with brief exchanges of routine check-ins. Somewhere in the distance, the elevator machinery engages with a soft mechanical whisper as it responds to a call from another floor. These sounds form the background of night shift work, as familiar and comforting as the rhythm of breathing. The next file contains a case that had generated considerable public attention when it occurred: the theft of a bronze statue from the downtown park. The statue, a memorial to local veterans, had stood in the same location for 43 years before disappearing one night with no witnesses and no obvious explanation for how such a heavy object could be moved without detection. The investigation had required consultation with metallurgists and art historians to establish the statue's weight and composition. Bronze, they learned, is an alloy primarily composed of copper, making it valuable to scrap metal dealers, but difficult to transport without specialized equipment. The statue weighed approximately 800 pounds and was bolted to a concrete foundation, with steel anchors that showed clear signs of having been cut with professional tools. Security cameras from nearby businesses had been examined frame by frame, revealing only empty views of the park during the relevant overnight hours. The theft had occurred during a new moon, when natural light was minimal, and streetlights around the park had been temporarily out of service due to scheduled maintenance. The timing suggested either careful planning or extraordinary luck. What fascinated investigators was the precision of the operation. The statue had been removed cleanly, with no damage to the surrounding landscaping or memorial plaques. The concrete foundation had been left intact, the cut anchor bolts neatly filed smooth. Someone had taken considerable care to minimize unnecessary destruction, suggesting either professional experience or genuine respect for the memorial's significance. Interviews with local scrap dealers revealed no one who admitted to purchasing bronze in the relevant time frame, though investigators acknowledged that such transactions often occur outside official channels. The statue's ultimate fate remained unknown, though theories ranged from resale to a private collector to simple destruction for the raw metal value. Chen finds herself imagining the logistics of such a theft, the planning required, the equipment needed, the coordination between multiple people that such an operation would demand. It speaks to a level of organization and capability that seems almost admirable, despite the criminal nature of the act. Someone had looked at an 800-pound bronze statue and seen not an immovable memorial, but a problem to be solved with the right tools and sufficient patience. The investigation had eventually been closed without resolution, not for lack of effort, but for lack of evidence. The case file preserves every lead that was followed, every witness who was interviewed, every theory that was explored and ultimately abandoned. It represents weeks of careful police work that yielded nothing definitive, yet created a comprehensive record of everything that was attempted. She opens another folder, this one containing the documentation of a breaking and entering case that had occurred in the warehouse district on the city's east side. The crime had been discovered by a security guard making his routine rounds, who found a loading dock door that had been carefully pried open and several shipping containers that showed signs of entry. The burglar had been selective in their targets. Of the dozens of containers in the warehouse, only 3 had been opened, and from those, only specific items had been taken. Computer equipment from one container, pharmaceutical supplies from another, designer clothing from the third. The pattern suggested someone with advanced knowledge of the shipping manifests, someone who knew exactly which containers held valuable and easily transportable merchandise. The investigation had focused on employees with access to shipping records, but background checks and interviews revealed nothing suspicious. Security logs showed no unauthorized access to the computer systems where manifests were stored. The burglar appeared to have obtained their information through means that remained invisible to investigators. What struck Chun about this case was the restraint involved. The burglar could have taken much more, could have opened additional containers or emptied the ones they targeted completely. Instead, they had taken only what they could easily carry and resell, leaving the majority of valuable merchandise untouched. It suggested either limited transportation capacity or a deliberate strategy to minimize the scope of the crime and reduce the likelihood of serious criminal charges. The warehouse had no interior security cameras, a fact that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. The burglar had chosen their target well, selecting a facility where they could work without being recorded. They had studied the security guard's schedule carefully enough to avoid detection, timing their entry and exit to occur during gaps in patrol coverage. Despite extensive investigation, no arrests were made in connection with this crime. The case file documents every lead that was pursued, every theory that was explored, every witness who was interviewed. It preserves the thoroughness of the investigation while acknowledging its ultimate limitations. Some crimes are simply executed too carefully to leave the kind of evidence that leads to prosecution. Chun stands and walks to the window that looks out over the city center. From this height, she can see the pattern of streetlights extending in all directions, marking the grid of streets and avenues that organize urban life. Most of the office buildings are dark now, their windows reflecting nothing but the night sky. Only a few scattered lights indicate the presence of people working through the overnight hours, security guards, cleaning crews, hospital staff, police officers like herself. The city at night reveals its essential structure in a way that daylight obscures. Without the visual noise of traffic and pedestrians, without the constant activity that fills every space during business hours, what remains is the underlying architecture of the place. The geometry of streets and buildings, the rhythm of traffic lights changing from red to green to yellow for empty intersections, the steady presence of streetlights maintaining visibility for no one in particular. Dak Chun returns to her desk and selects another file from the stack. This one documents a case of vandalism that had occurred at the main branch of the public library, where someone had defaced rare books with a substance that library conservators eventually identified as a mixture of coffee and ink. The damage had been discovered by a librarian opening the rare book collection for the day, finding that 12 volumes of local historical documents had been systematically marked with dark stains that obscured text and photographs. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that access to the rare book collection required special permission and was typically granted only to researchers with legitimate academic credentials. Security logs showed that 3 people had accessed the collection during the previous week, all of whom were interviewed extensively and provided alibis for their time in the library. The vandalism appeared to have been carried out with considerable knowledge of which books would be most difficult to replace. The damaged volumes included original city planning documents from the 1890s, photographs of downtown businesses from the 1920s, and handwritten accounts of local events during the Great Depression. These materials existed nowhere else and could not be restored once damaged. What puzzled investigators was the apparent randomness of the vandalism. The stains had been applied seemingly at random, with no pattern that suggested political motivation or personal vendetta. The perpetrator had simply destroyed irreplaceable historical materials for no discernible reason, then left the library without taking anything or causing additional damage. The case had generated considerable public interest, particularly among historians and preservationists who understood the unique value of the damaged materials. Local newspapers had covered the story extensively, prompting several anonymous tips that led nowhere. Despite offering a reward for information leading to an arrest, the crime remained unsolved. Chen reflects on the particular sadness of crimes against historical materials. Unlike theft, which at least preserves the possibility that stolen items might someday be recovered, vandalism creates irreversible loss. The damaged books represented decades of careful preservation work by librarians and volunteers, all undone in a few minutes by someone who apparently understood exactly what they were destroying. The next file tells the story of a more conventional crime: the theft of a delivery truck that had been abandoned several miles from where it was taken, its cargo of office supplies scattered along a rural road. The investigating officer had documented the scene with the same careful attention given to more serious crimes, photographing each scattered box and measuring the distances between items to reconstruct the sequence of events. The truck had been stolen from outside a warehouse during the driver's lunch break, taken by someone who apparently knew how to operate commercial vehicles but had no use for office supplies. The cargo had been dumped systematically, box by box, along a stretch of country road that saw little traffic. Paper clips, staplers, filing folders, and printer cartridges had been scattered across several hundred yards of asphalt and grass. What made this case interesting was the apparent pointlessness of the theft. The truck itself had been abandoned undamaged, keys still in the ignition, suggesting the thief had no intention of keeping it. The cargo had no significant resale value and would have been difficult to move quickly. The crime seemed motivated by something other than profit, perhaps boredom, perhaps anger, perhaps simple impulse. The investigation had been thorough but brief. Fingerprints were collected from the truck's interior, but none matched any records in the database. No witnesses had seen the theft or the subsequent dumping of cargo. The truck was returned to its owner, the scattered office supplies were collected and disposed of, and the case was filed away as one of those minor mysteries that occasionally disrupt the routine of commercial life. Chun finds herself thinking about the psychology of such apparently motiveless crimes. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to steal a truck and dispose of its contents, but for no apparent gain. There's something almost artistic about the way the cargo had been scattered along the rural road, as if the thief had been making some kind of statement about commerce or waste or the arbitrariness of value. She opens another file, this one thick with photographs and technical reports. A case involving the theft of copper wire from construction sites across the city, a crime that had occurred repeatedly over several months before suddenly stopping. The thief had targeted sites where electrical systems were being installed, cutting and removing wire that would not be missed until projects reached the inspection phase. The pattern had been discovered only when multiple contractors began reporting similar losses during the same time period. Each individual theft was relatively small, but together they represented thousands of dollars in stolen materials and project delays. The thief had been knowledgeable about construction schedules, striking only during periods when sites would be unattended for several days. Investigation revealed that copper wire has significant resale value and is difficult to trace once removed from its original context. Scrap dealers rarely ask questions about the source of copper, and the metal can be quickly melted down and sold to legitimate recycling operations. The thief had been exploiting a largely unregulated market for recycled metals. What impressed investigators was the planning involved. The thief had studied construction permits and schedules, identifying sites where wire had been installed, but not yet covered by walls or connected to electrical panels. They had worked quickly and efficiently, cutting only sections that were easily accessible and leaving no evidence of their presence beyond the missing materials. The crime had stopped as suddenly as it began, suggesting either that the thief had moved to a different area or had been satisfied with their profits. No arrests were made, though several scrap dealers were warned about purchasing copper wire without proper documentation. The case remains open, waiting for new incidents that might provide additional evidence. Chun pauses to consider the economics of such crimes. Someone had identified a market inefficiency: valuable materials left temporarily unguarded and exploited it systematically. The thief had probably earned more per hour than many legitimate jobs would pay, and had done so with minimal risk of prosecution. There's something almost entrepreneurial about such systematic theft. Though the social costs were distributed among contractors, property owners, and ultimately consumers, the night is advancing. And Chun can feel the subtle shift that occurs in the small hours, when even night shift workers begin to feel the weight of staying awake against the body's natural rhythms. The building around her has settled into its deepest quiet, and the stacks of case files on her desk seem to glow more softly in the amber light of the desk lamp. She reaches for another folder, this one containing the documentation of a fraud case that had unfolded over several years. An employee at a small accounting firm had been systematically redirecting client payments to personal accounts, using their access to banking information and their understanding of the firm's procedures to conceal the theft for an extended period. The fraud had been discovered only when a client questioned a billing discrepancy that seemed minor, but upon investigation, revealed a complex pattern of altered invoices and redirected payments. The employee had been careful to target only clients who paid infrequently and might not notice immediate discrepancies. They had also been selective about amounts, never taking enough from any single client to trigger obvious concern. The investigation had required forensic accounting work that took months to complete. Every transaction had to be traced through multiple accounts and cross-referenced with client records and bank statements. The employee had created a sophisticated system of false documentation that made the stolen funds appear to be legitimate business expenses or client refunds. What emerged from the investigation was a portrait of long-term financial pressure rather than sudden criminal intent. The employee had been struggling with medical bills from a family member's illness, expenses that had accumulated gradually over several years. The fraud had begun with small amounts intended to be temporary loans, but had escalated as the medical costs continued to mount and the opportunity for repayment became increasingly remote. The case had been resolved through plea bargaining rather than trial, with the employee accepting responsibility and agreeing to a repayment plan that would extend over several years. The accounting firm had implemented new procedures to prevent similar fraud, though investigators noted that any system based on trust among employees would remain vulnerable to someone with patience and inside knowledge. Chun reflects on the gradual nature of such crimes, how they often begin as attempts to solve immediate problems and evolve into systematic theft only over time. The employee in this case had probably never intended to become a criminal, but had found themselves in circumstances where each small compromise led inevitably to larger ones. The case file preserves not just the evidence of fraud, but the human story of how desperate circumstances can gradually erode ethical boundaries. Next file documents a breaking and entering case that had occurred at a pharmacy in one of the city's suburban shopping centers. The burglary had been discovered by a security guard who noticed that the front window, while intact, showed signs of having been carefully removed and replaced. The investigating officer had found that prescription medications had been stolen, but over-the-counter drugs and other valuable merchandise had been left untouched. The investigation had focused on people with knowledge of pharmaceutical values and procedures for securing prescription drugs. Pharmacy employees were interviewed, though none reported noticing anything unusual in the days preceding the burglary. Security camera footage from the shopping center showed a figure moving carefully around the building during overnight hours, but the image quality was insufficient for identification. What distinguished this burglary was the expertise involved. The perpetrator had known exactly which medications had high street value and were easily transportable. They had also understood the security systems well enough to avoid triggering alarms while working inside the building. The careful removal and replacement of the front window suggested either professional experience or extensive preparation. The stolen medications had never appeared in any seizures or arrests related to drug trafficking, suggesting either that they had been sold through networks unknown to local law enforcement or that they had been taken for personal use rather than resale. The case remained open, though new leads were unlikely given the time that had elapsed. And the lack of physical evidence, Chun considers the intersection between legitimate pharmaceutical needs and illegal drug markets that such cases represent. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to steal medications that are legally available through prescription, suggesting either that they lacked access to proper medical care or that they were supplying others who shared that circumstance. The crime exists at the boundary between healthcare and law enforcement, two systems that rarely coordinate effectively. She opens another folder, finding the documentation of a case involving the theft of metal from the city's recycling center. Copper pipes, aluminum siding, and brass fixtures had been systematically removed from the facility over a period of several weeks before the pattern was discovered during a routine inventory. The thief had been accessing the facility during hours when it was officially closed. Using knowledge of the security systems to avoid detection, the investigation had revealed that recycling centers are particularly vulnerable to theft because they contain large quantities of valuable metals in a relatively unguarded environment. The stolen materials had significant resale value, but more importantly, they were already sorted and prepared for transportation. The thief had simply been removing materials before the center could process them for legitimate sale. Security camera footage had captured images of someone working inside the facility, but the person had been careful to avoid showing their face and had worn clothing that made identification difficult. They had worked efficiently, taking only materials that could be easily transported and sold without raising suspicion at scrap dealers. The case had been complicated by the fact that recycling centers routinely handle materials of uncertain origin. Scrap dealers who might have purchased the stolen metals would not necessarily have known they were receiving stolen goods. And the legitimate recycling industry often involves materials that have passed through multiple hands before reaching their final destination. Despite extensive investigation, no arrests were made in connection with this theft. The recycling center had upgraded its security systems and changed its procedures for handling valuable metals. But investigators acknowledged that such facilities would remain attractive targets for people with knowledge of their operations and access to transportation. Chun stands again and walks slowly around the office, stretching muscles that have grown stiff from sitting. The night has reached that deep, quiet hour when most of the city sleeps, when even the background hum of distant traffic fades to almost nothing. From her window, she can see that most of the streetlights now illuminate empty sidewalks and vacant parking spaces. This is the time when police work becomes most contemplative, when there's space to consider not just the immediate facts of cases, but their larger patterns and meanings. Each file represents someone's decision to step outside the boundaries of legal behavior, but also represents the community's response to that decision, the careful documentation, the systematic investigation, the preservation of evidence and testimony that might someday lead to resolution. She returns to her desk and selects another file, this one containing the investigation of a hit-and-run accident that had occurred at an intersection known for traffic problems. A pedestrian crossing legally at a marked crosswalk had been struck by a vehicle that failed to stop, leaving behind only paint chips and tire marks as evidence of what had happened. The investigation had been exhaustive. Every auto body shop within a 100-mile radius had been contacted about vehicles with front-end damage. Traffic cameras from surrounding intersections had been reviewed to identify vehicles traveling toward or away from the accident scene during the relevant time period. Witnesses had been interviewed multiple times to extract every possible detail about the vehicle's appearance and behavior. The case file includes detailed diagrams of the intersection, measurements of skid marks and impact points, an analysis of the paint chips that had been collected from the roadway. Investigators had consulted with accident reconstruction specialists to determine the vehicle's speed and direction of travel. They had worked with medical examiners to understand the exact nature of the victim's injuries and their relationship to the physical evidence. Despite all this careful work, the case remained unsolved. The paint chips had been analyzed to determine the vehicle's color and approximate model year, but no specific vehicle had ever been identified. The hit-and-run driver had disappeared into the network of city streets, leaving behind only the scientific evidence of their presence and the human consequences of their decision to flee. Chun finds herself thinking about the psychology of hit-and-run accidents, how they represent not just traffic violations, but failures of basic human responsibility. Someone had struck another person and then chosen to drive away rather than stopping to help or accept accountability. The case file preserves not just the evidence of the accident, but the community's commitment to finding answers. Even when the perpetrator has long since disappeared, the next file documents a case of check fraud that had affected several small businesses in the downtown area. Someone had been altering stolen checks to change the payee names and amounts, then cashing them at different banks and check cashing services across the city. The scheme had been discovered when multiple businesses reported checks that had been cashed fraudulently, leading to a pattern that investigators were able to track. Across several weeks, the investigation had revealed sophisticated knowledge of banking procedures and check security features. The perpetrator had been using chemicals to alter ink without damaging the paper, then adding new information with pens that matched the original writing. They had also been careful to alter amounts in ways that would not trigger automatic fraud detection systems. What impressed investigators was the research involved. The fraudster had studied the check security features used by different banks and had developed techniques for defeating each type. They had also identified check cashing services that had less stringent verification procedures, allowing them to convert stolen checks to cash quickly before the fraud could be detected. The case had been solved when the perpetrator was arrested for an unrelated offense and found to be carrying several altered checks. Laboratory analysis confirmed that the same techniques had been used in all the downtown fraud cases. The arrest had ended the immediate threat, but investigators noted that the methods involved could easily be replicated by other criminals with sufficient motivation, and Patience Chun reflects on the technical sophistication of modern fraud. How criminals often develop expertise that rivals that of the security professionals trying to stop them. The case file preserves not just evidence of specific crimes, but documentation of methods that represent ongoing threats to financial systems. Each solved case contributes to a larger understanding of how fraud evolves and how prevention systems must adapt in response. She opens another folder, finding the documentation of a burglary that had occurred at an electronics store during a citywide power outage. The burglar had apparently understood that security systems would be disabled during the outage and had used the opportunity to enter the store and remove high-value merchandise without triggering alarms. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that the power outage had also disabled security cameras and electronic locks throughout the area. Physical evidence was limited to tool marks on the doorframe and footprints in dust near the electronics displays. The burglar had worked efficiently, taking only items that were both valuable and easily transported. What struck investigators was the timing involved. The power outage had been caused by a traffic accident that brought down electrical lines, an event that could not have been predicted. Yet someone had responded to the situation quickly enough to organize and execute a burglary while the security systems were disabled. This suggested either extraordinary opportunism or the possibility that the outage had been deliberately caused. Investigation of the traffic accident revealed no evidence of deliberate action, and the driver who had struck the electrical pole had been seriously injured and hospitalized. The burglary appeared to have been a genuine crime of opportunity, committed by someone who understood security systems well enough to recognize and exploit their temporary vulnerability. The case remained unsolved. Though the electronics store had installed backup power systems for their security equipment and changed their procedures for responding to power outages, the investigation had revealed how dependent modern security systems are on continuous electrical power. A vulnerability that extends far beyond single businesses to affect entire commercial districts. Chun pauses to consider how crimes often reveal weaknesses in systems that are otherwise taken for granted. The burglar in this case had not defeated the security system through sophisticated techniques, but had simply recognized a moment when the system was not functioning. Such insights often lead to improvements in security procedures. Though they come at the cost of the crimes that reveal the original vulnerabilities, the night continues its steady progression toward dawn. Though that transition is still hours away, Chun has settled into the rhythm of reading and reflection that makes night shift work both challenging and uniquely productive. Without the interruptions of phone calls and meetings, there's space to consider each case carefully, to look for patterns and connections that might be invisible during busier hours. She selects another file, this one containing the investigation of a sophisticated credit card fraud scheme that had affected hundreds of customers at restaurants throughout the city. Waitstaff at multiple establishments had been using small electronic devices to capture credit card information when processing payments, then selling that information to criminals who created counterfeit cards for fraudulent purchases. The investigation had required cooperation between local police, federal agencies, and credit card companies to track the flow of stolen information from restaurants to counterfeit card manufacturers to fraudulent transactions. The scheme had been operating for several months before being discovered, generating tens of thousands of dollars in losses for banks and individual cardholders. What made this case particularly complex was the organization involved. The waitstaff were not acting independently, but were part of a network that included people who manufactured the skimming devices, others who processed the stolen information, and still others who created and used the counterfeit cards. Each person in the network knew only their immediate contacts, making it difficult for investigators to understand the full scope of the operation. The case had been solved through a combination of surveillance and financial analysis. Investigators had identified patterns in where fraudulent transactions occurred and had traced them back to restaurants where affected customers had recently dined. Undercover operations had then been used to observe payment processing procedures and identify suspicious behavior. Multiple arrests had been made, though investigators believed that only a portion of the network had been identified. The case file preserves the methodology used to uncover the scheme, techniques that would prove valuable in investigating similar operations in the future. Chun closes the final file of her shift and arranges the folders in neat stacks according to their priority for follow-up work. The night has served its purpose, allowing time for careful consideration of cases that deserve more than hurried attention. Each file represents not just a crime, but a moment when the normal order of community life was disrupted, documented, and preserved for whatever justice might eventually be possible. The city outside her window shows the first subtle signs of approaching dawn, a slight shift in the quality of darkness, a change in the rhythm of distant traffic sounds. Soon the building will fill again with the energy of day shift activities, and these quiet hours of reflection will give way to the immediate demands of new cases and urgent matters. But for now, in these final moments of deep night, the files rest in their orderly stacks, each one a complete story waiting for its proper conclusion. The crimes they document have become part of the city's permanent memory, preserved in the careful language of investigation reports and the patient accumulation of evidence. Whatever resolution awaits each case, the work of documentation continues, adding each day's events to the growing archive of human behavior and community response. The night shift ends as it began, with the steady rhythm of breathing buildings and sleeping streets. The city holding its secrets in the amber light of institutional offices where someone is always awake, always watching, always adding new chapters to the long story of law and disorder. Crime and consequence, questions asked and answers sought in the endless patient work of justice. Asterisk. The morning shift brings a different energy to the municipal building, but the files remain constant, their manila covers unchanged by the rotation of personnel or the passage of hours. Detective Martinez arrives early, before the building fills with its daily complement of staff and visitors. When the hallways still echo with the particular emptiness of institutional spaces waiting to be inhabited. The filing system that houses these case records spans 3 full walls of the records room, each cabinet marked with year ranges and case number sequences that stretch back decades. The organization is both bureaucratic and oddly comforting. Every crime, no matter how small or large, receives the same systematic treatment, the same careful documentation, the same preservation in the amber of official procedure. Martinez opens the first file of the day, marked with a date from 8 months ago. Inside, the report begins with the standard heading information. Case number, investigating officer, date and time of initial report, location of incident. These headers appear on every police report in identical format, creating a template that imposes order on the chaos of criminal behavior. The standardization means that someone reading case files from 50 years ago would recognize the same basic structure, the same methodical approach to recording what happened when the normal patterns of community life were disrupted. This particular case involves the theft of landscaping equipment from a municipal maintenance facility. The report describes how the theft was discovered when workers arrived to begin their morning shift and found that 3 riding mowers, several smaller power tools, and a quantity of fertilizer had been removed from a locked storage building. The building itself showed signs of forced entry, but the damage had been minimal and carefully executed. Asterisk. The investigating officer had documented the scene with methodical precision. Measurements of tool marks on the doorframe, photographs of tire tracks in the gravel parking area, an inventory of missing items that included model numbers, serial numbers, and estimated replacement costs. The report notes that the stolen equipment had significant resale value but would also be useful for legitimate landscaping work, making it difficult to distinguish between stolen goods and legitimately acquired tools in the secondary market. Interviews with maintenance facility employees revealed that the theft had occurred during a window when the facility was unattended for approximately 8 hours. Security measures were limited to physical locks on buildings and a perimeter fence that showed no signs of being breached. The thief had apparently entered through the main gate, which was secured only by a chain and padlock that had been cut with bolt cutters. What impressed Martinez about this case was not the sophistication of the crime, but the thoroughness of the documentation. Every aspect of the investigation had been recorded in detail, from the initial scene assessment to the final interview with potential witnesses. The report includes diagrams of the facility layout, photographs of evidence, and transcripts of all witness statements. Someone reading this file decades from now would have a complete picture of not just what was stolen, but how the investigation was conducted and why it ultimately remained unsolved. The case had generated several leads that were systematically followed and documented. Local pawn shops were contacted about lawn equipment matching the description of stolen items. Classified advertisements in newspapers and online were monitored for several weeks. Known burglars with experience in equipment theft were interviewed, and their whereabouts during the relevant time period were verified. Despite these efforts, no arrests were made and the stolen equipment was never recovered. The case file concludes with a summary of all investigative activities and recommendations for preventing similar thefts in the future. The maintenance facility subsequently upgraded its security measures, installing motion-activated lighting and electronic surveillance systems. Martinez sets this file aside and reaches for another, this one marked with a date from nearly a year ago. The case involves credit card fraud discovered when a bank's automated systems detected unusual spending patterns on several customer accounts. The fraud had been sophisticated, involving the creation of counterfeit cards with valid account information, obtained through methods that were never definitively determined. The investigation had required coordination between local police and federal agencies, as credit card fraud typically involves violations of both state and federal law. The case file includes correspondence with bank security departments, credit card companies, and federal investigators, creating a paper trail that documents the complex jurisdictional issues involved in financial crimes. The fraudulent transactions had occurred at businesses throughout the region, suggesting either that the perpetrators were traveling extensively or that they were part of a network with participants in multiple cities. Each transaction had been carefully planned to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems, with purchases made for amounts and at merchants that would seem normal for the account holders. What distinguished this case was the research that had been conducted into the victims' spending habits. The fraudsters had studied legitimate purchase patterns carefully enough to mimic them convincingly, using the stolen cards at businesses where the actual cardholders frequently shopped and for amounts that matched their typical spending. This level of preparation suggested access to detailed account information that went beyond simple card numbers to include transaction histories. The investigation had ultimately identified several of the counterfeit cards and traced them to specific manufacturing sources, but the people responsible for creating and using them were never arrested. The case file documents the methodology used in the investigation, techniques that would prove valuable in future financial fraud cases, but that were insufficient to solve this particular crime. Martinez reflects on the evolution of financial crime as technology has advanced. The case file preserves not just evidence of specific fraudulent transactions, but documentation of methods and techniques that represent ongoing threats to electronic payment systems. Each investigation contributes to a larger understanding of how financial fraud operates and how prevention systems must adapt to stay ahead of criminal innovation. The next file contains the documentation of a burglary that had occurred at a small office building housing several professional service businesses. The crime had been discovered when employees arrived for work to find that computers, office equipment, and a small amount of cash had been taken from multiple suites within the building. The investigating officer had noted that the burglar appeared to have spent considerable time in the building, moving systematically from office to office and selecting items with apparent knowledge of their value and portability. Desktop computers had been taken while monitors were left behind. Small electronics like tablets and phones had been removed, while larger equipment like copiers and printers remained untouched. The building's security was minimal, consisting mainly of locked doors and windows without electronic surveillance or alarm systems. The burglar had entered through a rear window that had been carefully pried open without breaking the glass. Once inside, they had been able to move freely between offices, many of which were left unlocked during overnight hours. What struck the investigating officer was the selectivity involved. The burglar had clearly understood the difference between items with resale value and those that would be difficult to convert to cash. They had taken computer equipment, but ignored expensive software packages that would be useless without proper licensing. They had removed small amounts of cash from petty cash drawers, but left behind credit cards and checks that would require additional steps to monetize. The investigation had focused on people with knowledge of the building and its tenants, including current and former employees, service providers, and others who might have observed the layout and contents of the various offices. Background checks and interviews revealed no obvious suspects, though investigators noted that the burglar's familiarity with the building suggested either careful surveillance or inside knowledge. Despite extensive investigation, no arrests were made in connection with this burglary. The case file preserves the methodology used in the investigation and documents the security improvements that were implemented after the crime. The building's owners installed electronic surveillance systems and improved access controls, measures that would make similar crimes more difficult in the future. Martinez pauses to consider how office burglaries reflect changes in technology and workplace organization. The items targeted in this case: computers, tablets, mobile phones represent value in ways that would have been meaningless just a few decades ago. The case file documents not just a specific crime, but a moment in the ongoing evolution of what constitutes valuable and portable property in an increasingly electronic world. She opens another folder, finding the investigation of a case involving the theft of copper wire from residential construction sites. This crime had occurred repeatedly over several weeks before a pattern was identified, with thieves targeting houses under construction where electrical systems had been installed, but not yet enclosed within finished walls. The investigation had revealed that copper theft from construction sites had become a significant problem throughout the region, driven by high commodity prices and the relative ease of accessing construction materials before projects reached completion. The thieves had been knowledgeable about construction schedules, striking during periods when sites would be unattended, but after valuable materials had been installed. Each theft had been relatively small in scope, but the cumulative impact on construction projects had been substantial. Contractors reported delays and cost overruns as stolen materials had to be replaced and additional security measures had to be implemented. Some projects had been targeted multiple times, suggesting that the thieves were monitoring construction progress and returning when new materials became available. The case file includes photographs of damaged electrical systems and measurements of missing wire lengths. Investigators had worked with contractors to understand construction schedules and identify periods when sites were most vulnerable to theft. They had also consulted with scrap metal dealers to understand how stolen copper might be processed and sold. Despite surveillance of construction sites and increased patrols during vulnerable periods, no arrests were made in connection with these thefts. The crimes had eventually stopped, though whether this was due to police pressure, changes in copper prices, or the thieves moving to other areas remained unclear. The case file documents the investigative techniques that were employed and the security recommendations that were made to prevent future thefts. Martinez considers the economic factors that drive crimes like copper theft, how fluctuations in commodity prices can create opportunities for criminal activity that might not otherwise exist. The case file preserves not just evidence of specific thefts, but documentation of how global economic conditions can influence local crime patterns in ways that are often difficult to predict or prevent. The next file documents a case of check fraud that had affected a local nonprofit organization. Someone had obtained blank checks from the organization and used them to make unauthorized purchases at various businesses throughout the city. Fraud had been discovered when the organization's accountant noticed discrepancies during a routine review of monthly bank statements. The investigation had revealed that the fraudulent checks were genuine blanks that had been taken from the organization's supply, not counterfeits created by external parties. This suggested that the perpetrator had access to the organization's offices and storage areas, either as an employee, volunteer, or someone who had gained entry through other means. The unauthorized purchases had been made at businesses that typically accepted checks without requiring extensive identification, including grocery stores, gas stations, and small retail establishments. The amounts involved were relatively modest, apparently calculated to avoid triggering enhanced verification procedures that might apply to larger transactions. Interviews with organization staff and volunteers revealed that blank checks were stored in an unlocked filing cabinet in an office that was frequently left unattended. Many people had access to the office, and the missing checks might not have been noticed for weeks or months under normal circumstances. The fraud had been discovered only because of the accountant's careful attention to bank statements. Investigation had focused on people with access to the organization's offices, but this included dozens of employees, volunteers, and service providers. Background checks revealed no obvious suspects, and interviews produced no evidence pointing to any specific individual. The case remained unsolved, though the organization implemented new procedures for securing blank checks and monitoring their use. Martinez reflects on how such crimes exploit trust and informal security measures that work well under normal circumstances, but create vulnerabilities when abused. The case file documents not just the specific fraud, but the organizational changes that were implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future. She reaches for another file, this one containing the documentation of a breaking and entering case that had occurred at a warehouse storing restaurant supplies. The burglary had been discovered when employees arrived for work and found that large quantities of non-perishable food items had been removed from the facility. The investigating officer had noted that the burglar appeared to have been selective in their targets, taking primarily canned goods, dried foods, and other items with long shelf lives. Fresh produce and frozen foods had been left untouched, suggesting either that the burglar lacked refrigerated transportation or that they were specifically seeking items that could be stored for extended periods. The warehouse security consisted of locked doors and a basic alarm system that had been bypassed through techniques that suggested either professional experience or considerable preparation. The burglar had entered through a loading dock door that had been carefully opened without triggering the alarm sensors, a process that would have required knowledge of the security system's design and operation. What impressed investigators was the scale of the theft. The stolen food items filled several shopping carts worth of merchandise, suggesting either multiple trips or the use of a large vehicle for transportation. Despite this substantial volume of stolen goods, the burglar had worked without being detected by the warehouse's security systems or neighboring businesses. The investigation had focused on people with knowledge of food distribution systems and access to transportation suitable for moving large quantities of merchandise. This included current and former warehouse employees, delivery drivers, and others involved in the food service industry. Background checks and interviews revealed no obvious suspects. The stolen food items never appeared in any seizures or arrests related to stolen property, suggesting either that they had been consumed rather than resold, or that they had been distributed through networks unknown to law enforcement. The case remained unsolved, though the warehouse implemented additional security measures and changed its procedures for monitoring after-hours access. Martinez considers the possibility that such thefts might be motivated by need rather than profit, particularly given the selectivity for basic food items rather than more valuable merchandise. The case file preserves the investigation's methodology while acknowledging that the crime's motivation might have been different from typical commercial burglary. The morning progresses with its steady rhythm of file review and documentation. Each case represents hours of careful police work, preserved in the standardized format that allows investigations to be reviewed, analyzed, and learned from years after the original events occurred. The files accumulate in neat stacks on Martinez's desk, each one a complete story waiting for whatever resolution might eventually be possible. She opens another folder, finding the investigation of a sophisticated identity theft scheme that had affected dozens of victims across the region. The perpetrator had been obtaining personal information through various means and using it to open credit accounts, apply for loans, and make fraudulent purchases under assumed identities. The investigation had revealed a complex operation involving multiple phases and techniques. Personal information was initially obtained through methods that included mail theft, document theft from unlocked cars, and data harvesting from public records and social media accounts. This information was then used to create false identification documents and establish credit histories under the victims' names. The scheme had operated for several months before being detected. generating tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent debt that victims discovered only when they received bills for accounts they had never opened or applied for credit and were told that their credit history showed problems they were unaware of. What made this case particularly challenging was the geographic scope of the operation. Fraudulent accounts had been opened at banks and credit institutions across multiple states, making coordination between law enforcement agencies complex and time-consuming. Each fraudulent account required separate investigation and documentation, creating a massive paper trail that took months to compile and analyze. The case had eventually been solved when the perpetrator was arrested for an unrelated offense and found to be carrying false identification documents and stolen personal information. Laboratory analysis confirmed that the same techniques and materials had been used in the broader identity theft scheme, leading to additional charges and eventual prosecution. The case file includes detailed documentation of the methods used to obtain and exploit personal information, techniques that investigators noted could be easily replicated by other criminals with sufficient motivation and patience. The investigation had revealed vulnerabilities in credit reporting and account opening procedures that were subsequently addressed through policy changes and industry reforms. Martinez reflects on how identity theft represents a particularly invasive form of crime, one that affects not just victims' finances but their sense of security and privacy. The case file preserves not just evidence of specific fraudulent activities, but documentation of methods that represent ongoing threats to personal and financial security in an increasingly connected world. The next file documents a case involving the theft of tools from construction workers' vehicles. The crimes had occurred repeatedly over several weeks, with thieves targeting work trucks and vans parked overnight in residential areas. The pattern had been identified when multiple workers reported similar thefts during the same time period. The investigation had revealed that the thieves were knowledgeable about construction tools and their values, consistently targeting the most expensive and portable items, while leaving behind heavier equipment that would be difficult to transport quickly. They had also demonstrated understanding of construction workers' schedules, striking during periods when vehicles would be unattended for extended periods. The thefts had occurred in different neighborhoods, but followed similar patterns, suggesting either that the same individuals were responsible for multiple crimes, or that the techniques were being shared among different groups of thieves. In each case, vehicles had been entered through forced locks or broken windows, with thieves working quickly to remove valuable tools and equipment. Security camera footage from several incidents had captured images of people working around the targeted vehicles, but the image quality was insufficient for identification, and the perpetrators had been careful to avoid showing their faces clearly. The footage did reveal that the thieves were using their own vehicles for transportation, suggesting a level of organization and planning beyond simple opportunistic crime. Despite extensive investigation, including surveillance of areas where similar thefts had occurred and cooperation with tool retailers and pawn shops, no arrests were made in connection with these crimes. The thefts had eventually stopped, though whether this was due to police pressure or other factors remained unclear. The case file documents the investigative techniques that were employed and includes recommendations for construction workers to protect their tools and equipment. Many workers subsequently changed their storage and parking practices, though investigators noted that such crimes would remain attractive as long as valuable tools were left in relatively accessible locations. Martinez considers how such thefts affect not just individual workers, but entire industries, as increased security costs and insurance premiums are ultimately passed on to consumers through higher prices for construction and repair services. The case file preserves documentation of these broader economic impacts, along with the specific evidence of individual crimes. She reaches for another file, this one containing the investigation of a case involving fraudulent use of electronic payment systems. Someone had been using stolen credit card information to make online purchases that were then shipped to temporary addresses, where they could be retrieved without being traced to the perpetrator's actual identity or location. The investigation had required cooperation between local police, credit card companies, shipping companies, and online retailers to track the flow of stolen information from its initial theft through its use in fraudulent transactions. The scheme had been operating for several weeks before being detected, generating thousands of dollars in fraudulent charges. What distinguished this case was the sophistication of the address management system. The perpetrator had been using a network of temporary addresses, including mail forwarding services, vacant houses and businesses that were willing to accept packages for pickup by people claiming to be temporary employees or contractors. The fraudulent purchases had been carefully selected to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems. Items were chosen for their value-to-weight ratio and their ease of resale, with purchases spread across multiple retailers and shipping addresses to avoid creating obvious patterns that might attract attention. The case had been solved when investigators identified one of the temporary addresses and conducted surveillance. That led to the arrest of the perpetrator when they arrived to collect packages. Subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of the scheme and led to the recovery of substantial amounts of stolen merchandise. The case file includes documentation of the methods used to establish and maintain the network of temporary addresses. Techniques that investigators noted represented significant threats to electronic commerce security. The investigation had revealed vulnerabilities in address verification and package delivery procedures that were subsequently addressed through policy changes and industry reforms. Martinez reflects on how electronic commerce creates new opportunities for fraud that would have been impossible in earlier eras of purely physical retail transactions. The case file preserves not just evidence of specific crimes, but documentation of how criminal techniques evolve in response to technological change. The day continues its progression through the methodical review of cases, each file contributing to the larger understanding of crime patterns, investigative techniques, and community responses to criminal behavior. The standardized format of police reports creates continuity across different cases and different time periods, allowing patterns to emerge that might not be visible. When examining individual incidents in isolation, she opens another folder, finding the documentation of a burglary that had occurred at a medical office complex. The crime had been discovered when staff arrived for work and found that pharmaceutical samples, medical equipment, and patient records had been taken from multiple offices within the building. The investigating officer had noted that the burglar appeared to have specific knowledge of medical practices and the value of different types of pharmaceutical products. Controlled substances had been targeted while other medications were left untouched. Expensive medical devices had been taken while less valuable equipment remained in place. The building's security had consisted of locked doors and a basic alarm system that had been defeated through techniques that suggested either professional experience or extensive preparation. The burglar had entered through a window that provided access to a corridor connecting multiple offices, allowing them to move freely throughout the building once inside. Patient records had been taken along with pharmaceutical products, raising concerns about identity theft and privacy violations in addition to the immediate theft of medical supplies. The investigation had required notification of patients whose records might have been compromised, creating additional work for both law enforcement and medical office staff. The case had remained unsolved, despite extensive investigation, including interviews with current and former medical office employees, pharmaceutical sales representatives, and others with knowledge of medical office operations. The stolen pharmaceutical products never appeared in any seizures or arrests related to drug trafficking, and the patient records were never used in any detected identity theft schemes. Medical offices subsequently implemented enhanced security measures and changed their procedures for storing pharmaceutical samples and patient records. The case file documents these improvements along with the investigative techniques that were employed and the broader implications of crimes targeting medical facilities. Martinez considers how crimes against medical facilities affect not just the immediate victims, but entire communities that depend on medical services. The case file preserves documentation of these broader impacts, along with the specific evidence of the burglary itself. The afternoon brings its own rhythm to the work of file review, as the building around fills with the activity of day shift operations. Phone calls, meetings, and the constant flow of new cases create a backdrop of productive energy that contrasts with the quiet contemplation required for thorough case review. She reaches for another file, this one documenting a case of embezzlement that had affected a small retail business over a period of several months. An employee with access to cash handling and record keeping had been systematically diverting funds through various techniques designed to avoid detection during routine accounting procedures. The embezzlement had been discovered when the business owner noticed discrepancies between reported sales and actual inventory levels that could not be explained by normal variations in customer traffic or product movement. Further investigation revealed a pattern of altered sales records and cash handling irregularities that extended back several months. The case file includes detailed financial analysis showing how the embezzlement scheme had operated. Small amounts had been taken regularly rather than large sums occasionally, making the theft less noticeable in daily operations. Sales records had been altered to show lower transaction amounts than were actually collected, with the employee pocketing the difference. The investigation had required forensic accounting work to reconstruct actual sales figures and compare them with reported totals. This analysis revealed that the embezzlement had been systematic and sophisticated, involving knowledge of the business's accounting procedures and careful timing to avoid detection during monthly reconciliation processes. The case had been resolved through prosecution, with the employee accepting responsibility and agreeing to a restitution plan. The business implemented new procedures for cash handling and financial oversight, though investigators noted that any system based on employee trust would remain vulnerable to someone with patience and inside knowledge. The case file preserves not just evidence of the specific embezzlement, but documentation of the methods involved and the business practices that were changed to prevent similar crimes. Martinez reflects on how such cases often involve people who begin with minor violations and gradually escalate to more serious theft as opportunities and pressures develop over time. She opens another folder, finding the investigation of a case involving the theft of landscaping plants from residential properties. The crimes had occurred repeatedly over several weeks, with thieves targeting expensive ornamental plants and mature trees that had significant replacement costs. Investigation had revealed that plant theft from residential properties was driven by the high cost of mature landscaping and the difficulty of tracking plants once they were removed from their original locations. The thieves had been selective in their targets, consistently choosing plants that were both valuable and relatively easy to transplant. The thefts had occurred during daylight, hours when most residents were away from home, with thieves working quickly to remove plants using professional landscaping tools and techniques. Witnesses described seeing people who appeared to be legitimate landscaping workers, making it difficult for neighbors to recognize that theft was occurring. Security camera footage from several incidents had captured images of the theft in progress, but the perpetrators had been careful to position themselves to avoid clear facial images and had used vehicles with obscured license plates. The footage did reveal that the thefts were well-organized operations, involving multiple people and appropriate equipment for plant removal and transportation. Despite extensive investigation, including cooperation with nurseries and landscaping companies to identify possible resale channels for stolen plants, no arrests were made in connection with these crimes. The thefts had eventually stopped, though investigators noted that such crimes would remain attractive as long as mature landscaping maintained high replacement costs. The case file documents the investigative techniques that were employed and includes recommendations for residents to protect valuable landscaping. Many property owners subsequently installed additional security measures or chose less expensive plant varieties for areas visible from public streets. Martinez considers how plant theft represents a unique type of property crime, one that affects not just the immediate financial loss, but the long-term aesthetic and environmental value of residential neighborhoods. The case file preserves documentation of these broader impacts, along with the specific evidence of individual thefts. The day progresses through its methodical examination of cases, each file contributing another piece to the larger puzzle of criminal behavior and community response. The police reports follow their standard format, creating consistency that allows patterns to emerge across different types of crimes and different time periods. As afternoon fades toward evening, Martinez arranges the completed files in neat stacks according to their status and priority for follow-up action. Each case represents not just a disruption of normal community life, but the systematic response of law enforcement and the legal system to document, investigate, and preserve evidence of what happened when someone chose to step outside the boundaries of lawful behavior. The files rest quietly in their orderly arrangement, each one a complete record of human behavior at its moments of deviation from social norms, preserved in the careful language of official investigation and waiting for whatever resolution time and justice might eventually provide. The basement of the municipal building houses the oldest records, cases that have moved beyond active investigation into the realm of historical documentation. Here, beneath the daily operations of modern police work, decades of criminal investigation rest in climate-controlled silence, organized by year and case number in endless rows of industrial shelving that stretch from floor to ceiling. Detective Rodriguez makes the monthly descent to these archives, tasked with the routine but essential work of reviewing cold cases for any details that might connect to current investigations. The elevator doors open onto a corridor lined with fluorescent lights that hum softly in the recycled air, their steady illumination revealing doorways marked with year ranges, spanning back to the 1960s. Room 1975-1979 contains 5 years of criminal investigation compressed into metal shelving, units that would require a ladder to reach the highest files. Each shelf holds hundreds of case folders, their manila covers faded to varying shades of tan and yellow, some bearing the coffee stains and fingerprint smudges of detectives who investigated these crimes decades ago and have long since retired. Rodriguez selects a file at random from the 1977 section, opening it to reveal pages that crackle slightly as they separate after years of being pressed together. The typewritten text is clear, but shows the characteristic unevenness of manual typewriters, with some letters slightly raised above the baseline and others pressed deep enough to have left impressions on the pages beneath. The case involves the burglary of a hardware store that no longer exists, located on a street corner that has since been redeveloped into a shopping center. The investigating officer's report describes finding the front window broken and merchandise scattered throughout the store, suggesting that the burglar had worked hastily or had been interrupted during the crime. The language of the report reflects the formal police style of an earlier era, with complete sentences and careful attention to procedural detail that creates a sense of dignity around even routine crimes. The officer had noted the weather conditions, the lighting at the scene, the condition of neighboring businesses, and other environmental factors that modern reports often abbreviate or omit entirely. What strikes Rodriguez about reading this decades-old file is how thoroughly it documents not just the crime itself, but the world in which it occurred. The hardware store carried merchandise that would be unfamiliar to modern consumers, items whose purposes have been superseded by technological change or whose materials have been replaced by newer alternatives. The investigation included interviews with neighbors whose businesses have long since closed or been replaced by different enterprises entirely. The file contains black and white photographs of the crime scene, their silver-based emulsion still sharp and clear despite the passage of decades. These images preserve not just evidence of the burglary, but a visual record of commercial architecture, street layouts, and urban design from an era when the city was smaller and organized differently than it is today. The investigation had been thorough by the standards of its time, though it relied heavily on physical evidence and witness interviews, rather than the electronic surveillance and database searches that characterize modern police work. The investigating officer had canvassed the neighborhood systematically, documenting every conversation and observation in handwritten notes that were later transcribed into the formal report. Despite careful investigation, the case had remained unsolved, joining the thousands of other criminal investigations that represent the limits of law enforcement technology and resources in any given era. The file preserves not just the evidence that was collected, but the methodology that was available to investigators working with the tools and procedures of their time. Rodriguez replaces this file and selects another from the same year, this one documenting a case of embezzlement at a local bank that had closed. During the financial restructuring of the 1980s, the crime had been discovered through routine audit procedures that revealed discrepancies in account balances that could not be explained by normal banking operations. Investigation had required detailed analysis of handwritten ledgers and paper records that documented every transaction processed by the bank over a period of several months. The embezzlement scheme had been sophisticated for its era, involving the creation of fictitious accounts and the systematic transfer of small amounts from legitimate customer accounts to these false entries. The case file includes photocopies of the original ledger pages, their handwritten entries still legible, but showing the particular character of each bank employee's penmanship. These records preserve not just evidence of the embezzlement, but documentation of how financial institutions operated before electronic record-keeping and automated transaction processing became standard practices. The embezzlement had been discovered when a customer questioned a discrepancy in their account balance that seemed minor, but upon investigation revealed the broader pattern of unauthorized transactions. The bank had conducted its own internal investigation before involving law enforcement, creating a dual paper trail that documented both the criminal activity and the institution's response to discovering it. The case had been resolved through prosecution, with the embezzling employee accepting responsibility and agreeing to restitution. The bank had implemented new audit procedures and oversight controls, though the specific measures described in the file would be considered primitive by modern standards of financial security and fraud prevention. Rodriguez reflects on how this case documents not just a specific crime, but the evolution of financial institutions and the security measures they employ. The embezzlement techniques described in the file would be impossible to replicate in modern electronic banking systems, though they have been replaced by different vulnerabilities that require different protective measures. She moves deeper into the archives, selecting a file from 1976 that documents the investigation of a missing person case. A local shop owner had failed to open his business for several consecutive days, prompting concerned customers to contact police for a welfare check. The investigation had revealed that the man had disappeared without explanation, leaving behind his apartment, his business, and all of his personal possessions. The missing person investigation had been conducted with the methodical thoroughness that characterizes police work of any era, though the resources available to investigators were limited compared to modern capabilities. There were no electronic communication records to analyze, no credit card transactions to trace, no surveillance cameras to review. The investigation relied entirely on physical evidence and witness interviews, the case file documents, interviews with neighbors, customers, suppliers, and anyone else who had regular contact with the missing person. These conversations, preserved in the formal language of police reports, create a portrait not just of the individual who disappeared, but of the community relationships and daily routines that characterize small business operations in that era. Asterisk. The investigation had revealed that the missing person had been experiencing financial difficulties related to his business, though there was no evidence of debts large enough to explain voluntary disappearance. His personal relationships appeared stable, with no indication of domestic problems or conflicts that might have motivated him to leave. The case presented no obvious explanation for what had happened. Searches of the local area had been conducted using the resources available at the time: volunteer groups, local emergency services, and systematic coverage of areas where someone might become lost or injured. These searches had yielded no evidence of the missing person's fate, and the case had eventually been classified as inactive pending. New information. The file preserves not just the investigation itself, but the community response to the disappearance. Local businesses had organized search efforts, newspapers had published appeals for information, and customers had continued to check whether the shop had reopened long after the investigation had ended. The case documents how missing person incidents affect entire communities, not just the immediate families involved. Rodriguez considers how such cases represent the limits of investigation in any era, regardless of available technology. Some disappearances simply occur without leaving sufficient evidence to determine what happened, and the case files preserve these mysteries, along with the systematic efforts that were made to solve them. Moving to another section of the archives, she selects a file from 1978 that documents a case of vandalism at the high school that still operates today. Though in buildings that have been extensively renovated and expanded since the incident occurred, the vandalism had been discovered when staff arrived for work to find that several classrooms had been damaged in school. Property had been destroyed. The investigation had revealed that the vandalism was not random destruction, but appeared to target specific classrooms and facilities associated with particular teachers or programs. Windows had been broken in some rooms while others were left untouched. Equipment had been damaged in certain areas while valuable items in adjacent spaces remained undisturbed. The selective nature of the damage suggested that the vandalism was motivated by personal grievances rather than simple destructive impulse. The investigating officer had interviewed students, teachers, and staff members to identify any conflicts or disciplinary issues that might explain why specific areas of the school had been targeted. The case file includes photographs of the damage that preserve not just evidence of the vandalism, but visual documentation of what the high school looked like nearly 50 years ago. The classroom layouts, furniture styles, and educational equipment shown in these images create a historical record of how public education was organized and equipped in that era. The investigation had identified several students who had access to the building and potential motives for the vandalism, but physical evidence was insufficient to support criminal charges. The case had been resolved through the school's disciplinary procedures rather than the criminal justice system. Though the police investigation had provided important information for the school's internal proceedings, the school had implemented additional security measures following the incident, including changes to building access procedures and increased oversight of after-hours activities. The case file documents these improvements along with the investigation itself, preserving a record of how institutions adapt their security practices. In response to criminal incidents, Rodriguez reflects on how such cases document the intersection between law enforcement and educational institutions, showing how criminal investigations must sometimes defer to other forms of accountability and resolution. The case preserves not just evidence of specific crimes, but documentation of how different institutions cooperate to address problems that affect entire communities. Deeper in the archives, she finds files from 1979 that document a series of burglaries targeting small businesses in the downtown area. The crimes had occurred over a period of several months, with similar methods and target selection, suggesting that the same individuals were responsible for multiple incidents. The investigating officers had identified patterns in the timing and selection of targets that indicated careful surveillance and planning. The burglaries had occurred during periods when businesses would be closed for extended periods, and the thieves had consistently targeted establishments that carried valuable merchandise in relatively accessible locations. The case file documents the systematic approach used to investigate this crime series, with detailed analysis of timing patterns, target selection criteria, and methods of entry. The investigators had created charts and maps showing the relationships between different incidents, techniques that would be familiar to modern crime analysts, though they were executed entirely with paper records and manual calculation. Investigation had eventually led to arrests when one of the burglaries was interrupted by a security guard who was able to provide descriptions of the perpetrators and their vehicle. This single observation had provided the key evidence that connected multiple crimes and led to the solution of the entire series. The case file preserves not just evidence of the specific burglaries, but documentation of how serial crime investigations were conducted before electronic databases and computer analysis became available. The methodical approach described in these reports demonstrates that effective criminal investigation depends more on systematic thinking and careful attention to detail than on technological resources. The prosecution of this case had resulted in convictions and significant sentences for the perpetrators, who were also linked to similar crimes in neighboring jurisdictions. The case had become a model for investigating serial property crimes, and the techniques developed during this investigation were subsequently used in training programs for other law enforcement agencies. Rodriguez moves to another section of the archives, selecting a file from the early 1970s that documents a case involving the theft of art from a private residence. The crime had been discovered when the homeowners returned from vacation to find that several valuable paintings and sculptures had been removed from their home while other expensive items remained untouched. The investigation had revealed that the thief had specific knowledge of art values and markets, consistently selecting pieces that were both valuable and relatively easy to transport and sell. The selection process had required expertise that went beyond general knowledge of expensive items to include understanding of specific artists, periods, and market conditions. The case file includes detailed descriptions of the stolen artwork, complete with photographs and provenance documentation that the owners had maintained for insurance purposes. These records preserve not just evidence of the theft, but historical documentation of private art collections and the way such collections were assembled and maintained in earlier decades. Investigation had focused on people with access to information about the collection, including art dealers, insurance agents, domestic workers, and others who might have observed the artwork during legitimate visits to the residence. The systematic approach to identifying potential suspects demonstrates the thoroughness that characterized major theft investigations, even when technological resources were limited. Despite extensive investigation, the stolen artwork was never recovered, and no arrests were made in connection with the crime. The case file documents every lead that was pursued and every theory that was explored, creating a comprehensive record of how art theft investigations were conducted in an era before electronic databases and international cooperation became standard practices. Asterisk. The homeowners had subsequently installed additional security measures and changed their practices for displaying valuable artwork. The case file documents these changes, along with recommendations for preventing similar thefts, preserving information that would prove valuable for future investigations. Involving art crime, Rodriguez considers how this case documents the evolution of property crime as society has become more prosperous and acquired more valuable possessions. The art theft investigation required specialized knowledge and techniques that would not have been necessary in earlier eras when valuable portable property was less common in private residences. Moving through another section of the archives, she selects a file that documents a fraud case from the mid-1970s involving the sale of non-existent real estate to two victims who believed they were purchasing vacation property in a developing resort area. The scheme had operated for several months before being discovered when multiple victims attempted to visit their supposed properties and found that the land they had purchased did not exist. The investigation had revealed a sophisticated operation that included false documentation, fake photographs, and elaborate stories about development plans that would supposedly increase property values rapidly. The perpetrators had targeted victims who lived far from the supposed resort area and were unlikely to visit their purchases until after substantial payments had been made. The case file includes examples of the fraudulent sales materials, with their professional appearance and convincing details about amenities and investment potential. These documents preserve not just evidence of the specific fraud, but historical documentation of how real estate marketing was conducted and what techniques were used to create credibility with distant customers. The investigation had required cooperation between law enforcement agencies in multiple states, as the fraud had been conducted through mail systems and the perpetrators had operated from locations far from where their victims lived. This interstate coordination had been challenging. In an era before electronic communication and database sharing became routine law enforcement tools, the case had been solved when one of the perpetrators was arrested for an unrelated crime and found to be carrying false identification documents and fraudulent real estate contracts. This arrest had led to the discovery of the broader scheme and eventually to the prosecution of multiple individuals involved in the operation. The fraud had affected dozens of victims who lost substantial amounts of money that was never recovered. The case file documents not just the criminal prosecution, but the civil proceedings through which victims attempted to recover their losses and the regulatory changes that were implemented to prevent similar schemes in the future. Rodriguez reflects on how this case documents the evolution of fraud techniques as communication and transportation systems have made it easier for criminals to operate across great distances. The real estate fraud described in this file would be much more difficult to execute in the modern era of electronic record-keeping and instant communication. Though it has been replaced by different schemes that exploit current technologies, the archives continue their silent preservation of decades of criminal investigation. Each file a complete record of human behavior at its moments of deviation from lawful conduct. The consistency of the police report format creates continuity across different eras, allowing patterns to emerge that might not be visible when examining individual cases in isolation. She opens another file from 1977, this one documenting the investigation of a hit-and-run accident that had occurred on a rural highway outside the city limits. The victim had been walking along the shoulder of the road when struck by a vehicle that left the scene without stopping. The investigation had been complicated by the remote location and the lack of witnesses to the incident. The case file documents the systematic approach used to investigate hit-and-run accidents before modern forensic techniques became available. Physical evidence collection had focused on paint chips, tire marks, and other traces that might identify the type of vehicle involved. Though the analysis capabilities were limited compared to current standards, the investigation had included examination of all vehicles in the area that might have been involved, with particular attention to body shops and repair facilities where damaged vehicles might be taken for service. This canvass had been conducted entirely through personal visits and telephone calls, creating a paper trail that documents how such investigations were managed without electronic databases. Despite extensive investigation, the case had remained unsolved. The hit-and-run driver had disappeared into the network of rural roads and highways, leaving behind only the physical evidence collected at the scene and the systematic documentation of everything that had been attempted to identify them. The case file preserves not just the specific investigation, but the methodology that was available to traffic accident investigators working with the technology and resources of their era. The thoroughness described in these reports demonstrates that effective investigation depends more on systematic approach and attention to detail than on sophisticated equipment. Rodriguez moves deeper into the archives, where the oldest files rest in climate-controlled storage that preserves paper documents that might otherwise deteriorate over decades of storage. Here, cases from the 1960s rest in their original folders, their typewritten pages still legible and their attached photographs still clear, enough to serve as evidence if needed. A file from 1968 documents the investigation of a burglary at a jewelry store that occurred during a citywide power outage caused by a severe thunderstorm. The burglar had apparently understood that security systems would be disabled during the outage and had used the opportunity to enter the store and remove valuable merchandise. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that the power outage had also disabled security cameras and electronic locks throughout the commercial district. Physical evidence was limited to tool marks on doors and windows and footprints in areas where water had leaked through the roof during the weather storm. The case file includes weather reports and utility company records that document the timing and extent of the power outage, creating a comprehensive record of the conditions that enabled the crime. This attention to environmental factors demonstrates the thoroughness that characterized major theft investigations even when technological resources were minimal. The stolen jewelry had never been recovered, and no arrests were made in connection with the crime. Despite an investigation that included interviews with everyone who had access to information about the store's security systems and inventory, the case had eventually been classified as inactive, though the investigation techniques that were developed had proved valuable for future cases involving crimes during emergency conditions. Jewelry store had subsequently installed backup power systems for their security equipment and changed their procedures for responding to power outages. The case file documents these improvements along with the investigation itself, preserving information that would influence security practices throughout the jewelry industry. Rodriguez considers how this case documents the vulnerability of security systems to environmental conditions and infrastructure failures that cannot be predicted or prevented. The burglary investigation had revealed weaknesses in emergency planning that extended far beyond individual businesses to affect entire commercial districts. As the afternoon progresses through its quiet examination of historical cases, Rodriguez becomes aware of the accumulated weight of decades of criminal investigation preserved in these archives. Each file represents not just a specific crime, but a moment when the normal order of community life was disrupted and the systematic response of law enforcement was brought to bear on restoring accountability and order. The files rest in their organized rows, each one a complete story of human behavior and institutional response, waiting for whatever insights future examination might provide. The archives preserve not just evidence of past crimes, but the methodology and dedication of investigators who worked with whatever resources were available to them to seek truth and justice in their own eras. The dust that settles on these folders is not neglect, but the natural accumulation of time passing over work that was completed thoroughly and preserved completely. Each case file remains ready to contribute to current investigations if connections emerge, ready to teach new investigators about techniques that remain valuable regardless of technological change, ready to remind anyone who examines them that the fundamental work of law enforcement, careful observation, systematic analysis, and persistent dedication to truth remains constant across decades and generations. The basement archives hold their silence, preserving the accumulated wisdom of criminal investigation in the patient darkness of climate-controlled storage, where time moves slowly and the work of justice continues its quiet preservation of memory and evidence. Accountability and hope. The county courthouse occupies a full city block downtown, its limestone facade weathered by decades of seasons, but still imposing in the way that civic architecture was designed to convey the weight and permanence of legal authority. After the last hearing ends and the final clerk locks the filing cabinets, the building settles into a different kind of existence, one measured not by the urgency of scheduled proceedings, but by the slow passage of institutional time. Detective Williams walks the empty corridors during the overnight hours when security rounds require checking each floor of the building. Her footsteps echo against marble floors that have absorbed thousands of similar sounds over the decades. The measured pace of judges approaching their benches, the hurried steps of attorneys rushing between courtrooms, the uncertain shuffle of defendants approaching sentencing. The main courtroom on the third floor retains its formal dignity even in darkness, with wooden benches arranged in precise rows, facing the judge's bench that sits elevated above the proceedings like an altar of legal authority. The witness stand occupies its traditional position to the right of the bench, a simple wooden chair surrounded by a low railing that has contained the testimony of countless individuals whose words became part of the permanent record of criminal proceedings. During daylight hours, this courtroom fills with the drama of legal argument and the careful ritual of evidence presentation. Prosecutors outline their cases with methodical precision. Defense attorneys challenge evidence and testimony. Judges maintain order and interpret law. Juries wrestle with the weight of determining guilt or innocence. But in the quiet hours, the room exists in potential, waiting for the next day's proceedings to bring it back to life. The evidence storage room in the courthouse basement contains physical items from hundreds of criminal cases, each piece carefully cataloged and preserved according to strict chain of custody procedures. Plastic bags hold fragments of broken glass from crime scenes. Metal containers preserve soil samples and trace evidence. Locked cabinets store weapons that once played central roles in violent crimes, but now rest in clinical isolation. Williams pauses before a shelf containing evidence from a robbery case that concluded 6 months ago. The items tell their own story without need for testimony or legal argument. Crowbar with paint chips that matched marks found at the crime scene. A ski mask containing DNA, evidence that identified the perpetrator. photographs that documented the aftermath of violence in stark black and white detail. Each piece of evidence represents hours of careful collection and analysis by crime scene technicians who understood that justice often depends on the smallest details being preserved and protected from contamination or loss. The evidence storage system ensures that years after trials conclude, the physical proof remains available for appeals, review, or connection to other cases that might emerge. Rodriguez reflects on how this case documents the evolution of fraud techniques as communication and transportation systems have made it easier for criminals to operate across great distances. The real estate fraud described in this file would be much more difficult to execute in the modern era of electronic record-keeping and instant communication. Though it has been replaced by different schemes that exploit current technologies, the archives continue their silent preservation of decades of criminal investigation. Each file a complete record of human behavior at its moments of deviation from lawful conduct. The consistency of the police report format creates continuity across different eras, allowing patterns to emerge that might not be visible. When examining individual cases in isolation, she opens another file from 1977. This one documenting the investigation of a hit-and-run accident that had occurred on a rural highway outside the city limits. The victim had been walking along the shoulder of the road when struck by a vehicle that left the scene without stopping. The investigation had been complicated by the remote location and the lack of witnesses to the incident. The case file documents the systematic approach used to investigate hit-and-run accidents before modern forensic techniques became available. Physical evidence collection had focused on paint chips, tire marks, and other traces that might identify the type of vehicle involved. Though the analysis capabilities were limited compared to current standards, the investigation had included examination of all vehicles in the area that might have been involved, with particular attention to body shops and repair facilities where damaged vehicles might be taken for service. This canvass had been conducted entirely through personal visits and telephone calls, creating a paper trail that documents how such investigations were managed without electronic databases. Despite extensive investigation, the case had remained unsolved. The hit-and-run driver had disappeared into the network of rural roads and highways, leaving behind only the physical evidence collected at the scene and the systematic documentation of everything that had been attempted to identify them. The case file preserves not just the specific investigation, but the methodology that was available to traffic accident investigators working with the technology and resources of their era. The thoroughness described in these reports demonstrates that effective investigation depends more on systematic approach and attention to detail than on sophisticated equipment. Rodriguez moves deeper into the archives, where the oldest files rest in climate-controlled storage that preserves paper documents that might otherwise deteriorate over decades of storage. Here, cases from the 1960s rest in their original folders, their typewritten pages still legible and their attached photographs still clear, enough to serve as evidence if needed. A file from 1968 documents the investigation of a burglary at a jewelry store that occurred during a citywide power outage caused by a severe thunderstorm. The burglar had apparently understood that security systems would be disabled during the outage and had used the opportunity to enter the store and remove valuable merchandise. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that the power outage had also disabled security cameras and electronic locks throughout the commercial district. Physical evidence was limited to 2 marks on doors and windows and footprints in areas where water had leaked through the roof during the winter storm. The case file includes weather reports and utility company records that document the timing and extent of the power outage, creating a comprehensive record of the conditions that enabled the crime. This attention to environmental factors demonstrates the thoroughness that characterized major theft investigations, even when technological resources were minimal. The stolen jewelry had never been recovered, and no arrests were made in connection with the crime, despite an investigation that included interviews with everyone who had access to information about the store's security systems and inventory. The case had eventually been classified as inactive, though the investigation techniques that were developed had proved valuable for future cases involving crimes during emergency conditions. Jewelry store had subsequently installed backup power systems for their security equipment and changed their procedures for responding to power outages. The case file documents these improvements along with the investigation itself, preserving information that would influence security practices throughout the jewelry industry. Rodriguez considers how this case documents the vulnerability of security systems to environmental conditions and infrastructure failures that cannot be predicted or prevented. The burglary investigation had revealed weaknesses in emergency planning that extended far beyond individual businesses to affect entire commercial districts. As the afternoon progresses through its quiet examination of historical cases, Rodriguez becomes aware of the accumulated weight of decades of criminal investigation preserved in these archives. Each file represents not just a specific crime, but a moment when the normal order of community life was disrupted and the systematic response of law enforcement was brought to bear on restoring accountability and order. The files rest in their organized rows, each one a complete story of human behavior and institutional response, waiting for whatever insights future examination might provide. The archives preserve not just evidence of past crimes, but the methodology and dedication of investigators who worked with whatever resources were available to them to seek truth and justice in their own eras. The dust that settles on these folders is not neglect, but the natural accumulation of time passing over work that was completed thoroughly and preserved completely. Each case file remains ready to contribute to current investigations if connections emerge, ready to teach new investigators about techniques that remain valuable regardless of technological change, ready to remind anyone who examines them that the fundamental work of law enforcement, careful observation, systematic analysis, and persistent dedication to truth remains constant across decades and generations. The basement archives hold their silence, preserving the accumulated wisdom of criminal investigation in the patient darkness of climate-controlled storage, where time moves slowly and the work of justice continues its quiet preservation of memory and evidence. Accountability and hope. The county courthouse occupies a full city block downtown, its limestone facade weathered by decades of seasons, but still imposing in the way that civic architecture was designed to convey the weight and permanence of legal authority. After the last hearing ends and the final clerk locks the filing cabinets, the building settles into a different kind of existence, one measured not by the urgency of scheduled proceedings, but by the slow passage of institutional time. Detective Williams walks the empty corridors during the 5 overnight hours when security rounds require checking each floor of the building. Her footsteps echo against marble floors that have absorbed thousands of similar sounds over the decades. The measured pace of judges approaching their benches, the hurried steps of attorneys rushing between courtrooms, the uncertain shuffle of defendants approaching sentencing. The main courtroom on the 3rd floor retains its formal dignity even in darkness, with wooden benches arranged in precise rows, facing the judge's bench that sits elevated above the proceedings like an altar of legal authority. The witness stand occupies its traditional position to the right of the bench, a simple wooden chair surrounded by a low railing that has contained the testimony of countless individuals whose words became part of the permanent record of criminal proceedings. During daylight hours, this courtroom fills with the drama of legal argument and the careful ritual of evidence presentation. Prosecutors outline their cases with methodical precision. Defense attorneys challenge evidence and testimony. Judges maintain order and interpret law. Juries wrestle with the weight of determining guilt or innocence. But in the quiet hours, the room exists in potential, waiting for the next day's proceedings to bring it back to life. The evidence storage room in the courthouse basement contains physical items from hundreds of criminal cases, each piece carefully cataloged and preserved according to strict chain of custody procedures. Plastic bags hold fragments of broken glass from crime scenes. Metal containers preserve soil samples and trace evidence. Locked cabinets store weapons that once played central roles in violent crimes, but now rest in clinical isolation. Williams pauses before a shelf containing evidence from a robbery case that concluded 6 months ago. The items tell their own story without need for testimony or legal argument. A crowbar with paint chips that matched marks found at the crime scene. A ski mask containing DNA evidence that identified the perpetrator. Photographs that documented the aftermath of violence in stark black and white detail. Each piece of evidence represents hours of careful collection and analysis by crime scene technicians who understood that justice often depends on the smallest details being preserved and protected from contamination or loss. The evidence storage system ensures that years after trials conclude, the physical proof remains available for appeals, review, or connection to other cases that might emerge. The holding cells adjacent to the courtrooms occupy a section of the building designed for temporary detention of defendants during trial proceedings. These small rooms contain only the essential furniture, a metal bench, a sink, a toilet arranged in spaces barely large, enough for a single person to pace the few steps from wall to wall. The cells are empty now, their heavy steel doors standing open to reveal interiors, painted in the neutral colors that institutional designers believe minimize psychological impact. But during trial days, these spaces hold individuals at the most critical moments of their lives, waiting for juries to return verdicts that will determine their futures. Williams considers the psychological weight that must accumulate in such spaces, where people spend hours contemplating the possibility of conviction and sentencing. The cells are cleaned regularly and maintained in good repair, but they cannot be cleansed of the anxiety and fear that fills them whenever the legal system processes another human life through its careful machinery of judgment. Jury deliberation room on the second floor contains a large wooden table surrounded by 12 chairs, each positioned to allow equal participation in the discussions that determine the outcomes of criminal trials. The room has no windows, ensuring that jurors cannot be influenced by outside events or demonstrations that might occur during high-profile cases. The table bears the accumulated marks of decades of deliberation. Water rings from coffee cups, scratches from pens and pencils used to take notes, worn spots where countless hands have rested during long discussions about evidence and testimony. These physical traces preserve the reality of jury service, the way ordinary citizens wrestle with complex legal questions and the burden of making decisions that affect other people's lives. During deliberations, this room becomes the most important space in the courthouse, where 12 individuals who were strangers before selection work together to understand evidence, apply legal instructions, and reach unanimous decisions about guilt or innocence. The isolation of the room ensures that these discussions occur without outside pressure or influence, preserving the integrity of the jury system. Williams moves through the attorneys' conference rooms where plea negotiations are conducted and legal strategies are developed. These smaller spaces contain simple furniture, a table, several chairs, basic lighting, but they host some of the most consequential conversations in the criminal justice system. Here, prosecutors and defense attorneys engage in the complex bargaining that resolves the majority of criminal cases without trial. The conference rooms preserve confidentiality for these sensitive discussions, where the formal adversarial process gives way to practical negotiations about charges, sentences, and the resolution of cases through guilty pleas. The conversations that occur in these rooms determine the actual outcomes of most criminal prosecutions, though they remain largely invisible to the public that witnesses only the formal courtroom proceedings. The law library occupies a quiet corner of the courthouse, its shelves containing volumes of case law, statutes, and legal precedents that form the foundation for all criminal proceedings. The books show the accumulated wear of decades of research by attorneys, preparing arguments, and judges researching legal questions that arise during trials. During business hours, the library buzzes with the activity of legal research and preparation. Attorneys review precedents that might support their arguments. Clerks verify citations and quotations. Judges research complex legal questions that require careful analysis of established law. But in the overnight hours, the books rest in their ordered arrangement, containing the accumulated wisdom of legal decision-making that guides contemporary justice. The appeals court occupies the top floor of the courthouse, where a panel of judges reviews trial court decisions for legal errors that might have affected the outcomes of criminal cases. The appeals courtroom is smaller than the trial courts, reflecting the different nature of appellate proceedings that focus on legal argument rather than evidence presentation. The appellate process operates on a different timeline than trial courts, with cases moving through written briefs and oral arguments that can take months or years to complete. The appeals judges review trial transcripts and legal arguments to determine whether convicted defendants received fair trials and whether the law was properly applied to their cases. Williams pauses in the appellate courtroom, considering how this space represents the criminal justice system's commitment to review and correction. The appeals process acknowledges that trial courts can make errors and provides a mechanism for correcting mistakes that might have led to wrongful convictions or inappropriate sentences. Administrative offices throughout the courthouse maintain records and scheduling that keep the criminal justice system functioning. Court clerks process thousands of documents each month, maintaining files for every case and ensuring that legal deadlines are met and proper procedures are followed. The filing systems preserve complete records of every criminal case processed through the courthouse, creating an archive of legal decisions that can be referenced for years after cases conclude. These records ensure continuity and accountability in the legal system, allowing patterns to be identified and precedents to be established that guide future proceedings. The probation office occupies a section of the courthouse where convicted defendants report for supervision and monitoring after sentencing. The office contains interview rooms where probation officers meet with their clients to discuss compliance with court orders and progress toward rehabilitation. Probation represents the criminal justice system's recognition that punishment and accountability can take forms other than incarceration, allowing convicted individuals to remain in the community while serving their sentences under supervision. The probation office balances enforcement of court orders with support for rehabilitation and reintegration. Williams moves through the victim services, offices where support is provided to people who have been harmed by criminal activity. These spaces contain comfortable furniture and private meeting areas where victims can receive information about court proceedings and assistance with the practical and emotional challenges of participating in criminal prosecutions. The Victim Services program acknowledges that the criminal justice system must serve not only the abstract interests of law and order, but the concrete needs of individuals who have been directly affected by criminal behavior. These offices provide a space within the courthouse where victims can find support and advocacy during what is often a difficult and confusing process. The juvenile court occupies a separate section of the building, designed to handle cases involving defendants who are under 18 years of age. The juvenile courtroom is smaller and less formal than adult criminal courts, reflecting the different philosophy that guides the prosecution of young offenders. Juvenile proceedings focus more heavily on rehabilitation and family involvement than adult criminal courts, recognizing that young people may be more likely to respond positively to intervention and support than to traditional punishment. The juvenile court balances accountability for criminal behavior with acknowledgement of the developmental factors that influence adolescent decision-making. Courthouse cafeteria serves hundreds of people each day during business hours. Attorneys, judges, court staff, jurors, witnesses, and family members attending trials. The cafeteria provides a neutral space where the various participants in criminal proceedings can take breaks from the intensity of courtroom activities. During overnight hours, the cafeteria stands empty but ready, its tables and chairs arranged for the next day's service. The space represents the human side of the criminal justice system, acknowledging that legal proceedings require sustained attention and energy from everyone involved. Williams continues her rounds through the courthouse security office, where monitors display feeds from cameras throughout the building and metal detectors ensure that weapons cannot be brought into courtrooms. The security systems reflect the recognition that criminal proceedings can generate strong emotions and that public safety requires careful attention to building access and monitoring. The courthouse security officers work around the clock to maintain safety for everyone in the building. During trial days, they screen hundreds of visitors and monitor courtrooms for signs of disruption or conflict. During overnight hours, they conduct regular patrols to ensure that the building and its contents remain secure. The courthouse holding area includes larger cells designed for group detention when multiple defendants are being processed through the courts simultaneously. These spaces are designed for temporary use but must accommodate the reality that court schedules sometimes require defendants to wait for hours before their cases are called. The group holding areas include basic amenities and supervision to ensure that defendants awaiting court appearances remain safe and secure. The design acknowledges the presumption of innocence that applies to defendants who have not yet been convicted, while maintaining the security necessary for orderly court proceedings. Williams pauses in the courthouse chapel, a small interfaith space where people can find quiet reflection during what are often the most stressful experiences of their lives. The chapel contains simple wooden pews and symbols from various religious traditions, acknowledging that spiritual support can be important for people facing criminal prosecution or serving as witnesses in difficult cases. The chapel represents the recognition that the criminal justice system deals with fundamental questions about human behavior, responsibility, and redemption that extend beyond purely legal considerations. The space provides an opportunity for reflection and contemplation within the formal structure of legal proceedings. The courthouse nursery provides childcare for parents who must attend court proceedings but cannot arrange alternative care for their children. The nursery acknowledges that criminal proceedings affect entire families and that practical barriers should not prevent people from participating in the legal process. The nursery staff are trained to work with children who may be experiencing stress related to their family's involvement in criminal cases. The service represents the courthouse's recognition that justice requires removing practical obstacles that might prevent full participation in legal proceedings. The Courthouse Medical Facility provides basic health care for people who experience medical emergencies during court proceedings. The facility is staffed by trained medical personnel who can respond to the physical and emotional stress that legal proceedings can generate. Medical facility acknowledges that criminal trials can be intensely stressful, experiences that may trigger health problems for defendants, witnesses, victims, and even spectators. The availability of immediate medical care ensures that health emergencies do not disrupt court proceedings or endanger participants. Williams concludes her rounds in the courthouse basement, where the building's mechanical systems maintain the climate control and lighting that keep the facility functioning around the clock. The basement also contains storage areas for archived case files, evidence that is no longer needed for active proceedings, and supplies necessary for courthouse operations. The basement represents the infrastructure that supports the visible work of the criminal justice system. Like the foundation of any building, these systems operate largely unseen but provide essential support for everything that occurs in the courtrooms and offices. Above, the courthouse stands as a monument to the community's commitment to resolving conflicts and maintaining order through legal processes rather than private vengeance or arbitrary authority. The building's architecture and organization reflect centuries of development in legal institutions and procedures designed to ensure fairness and accountability in criminal proceedings. During daylight hours, the courthouse fills with the drama and complexity of human conflict being processed through legal institutions. Prosecutors present evidence, defense attorneys challenge accusations, judges interpret law, juries deliberate guilt or innocence, and sentences are pronounced that will affect people's lives for years to come. But in the quiet overnight hours, the courthouse exists in potential. Its empty courtrooms and vacant offices waiting for the next day's proceedings to bring them back to life. The building preserves the dignity and authority of legal institutions while acknowledging the human costs and benefits of criminal justice. The Poste de Courseveille County Jail occupies a separate building connected to the courthouse by an underground tunnel that allows secure transport of defendants to court proceedings. The jail represents a different aspect of the criminal justice system, focused on detention and punishment rather than adjudication and legal argument. Detective Williams occasionally visits the jail as part of ongoing investigations, walking through corridors lined with cell doors that contain individuals at various stages of the criminal justice process. Some are awaiting trial and are presumed innocent under legal standards. Others have been convicted and are serving sentences or awaiting transfer to state facilities. The jail operates according to strict security protocols that govern every aspect of daily life for inmates and staff. Cell blocks are organized by security classification and offense type, with different levels of restriction and privilege depending on the perceived risk that inmates pose to themselves, other inmates, or staff members. The booking area processes new arrivals to the jail, conducting the systematic documentation and property inventory that transforms free individuals into inmates within the corrections system. The booking process includes fingerprinting, photographing, medical screening, and classification assessment that determines where inmates will be housed and what privileges they will receive. Jail Medical Facility provides health care for inmates who may have ongoing medical conditions or who experience health problems during their incarceration. The medical staff must balance security requirements with the ethical obligation to provide appropriate health care to people who cannot seek treatment outside the facility. The jail visiting area allows inmates to maintain contact with family members and attorneys, though these interactions occur under security conditions that acknowledge the institutional setting. Visiting rooms are designed to prevent contraband transfer while allowing meaningful communication between inmates and their outside contacts. The jail library provides access to legal materials that inmates may need to research their cases or file appeals and other legal documents. The library acknowledges the constitutional right of inmates to access the courts, even when they cannot afford attorneys to represent them in post-conviction proceedings. The jail educational facilities offer classes and programming designed to help inmates develop skills and knowledge that may be useful for reintegration after release. These programs represent the corrections system's recognition that incarceration should include opportunities for rehabilitation and personal improvement. The jail work programs allow inmates to earn small amounts of money while contributing to facility operations through food service, maintenance, laundry, and other essential tasks. The work programs provide structure and purpose while reducing the costs of jail operations. Williams observes the quiet efficiency of jail operations during overnight hours, when most inmates are sleeping and staff focus on security rounds and administrative tasks. The jail operates according to precise schedules that govern meals, recreation, medical care, and all other aspects of daily life. The jail represents society's decision to remove certain individuals from the community as punishment for criminal behavior or to ensure their appearance at trial. The facility balances security requirements with constitutional obligations to provide humane conditions for people who retain fundamental rights despite their incarceration. The police station where Williams is normally assigned operates around the clock with different shifts handling the varying demands of law enforcement work. The station contains investigation units, evidence storage, interview rooms, and administrative offices that support the complex work of modern policing. Interview rooms are designed to facilitate questioning of suspects and witnesses while ensuring that statements can be recorded and verified. These rooms contain simple furniture and recording equipment that preserves conversations for later use in court, proceedings, or further investigation. Evidence storage areas maintain chain of custody for physical items collected during criminal investigations. The storage systems ensure that evidence remains secure and uncontaminated while being available for laboratory analysis, court presentation, and long-term preservation. The detective bureaus contain workstations and filing systems that support ongoing criminal investigations. Detectives maintain case files, conduct interviews, coordinate with other agencies, and prepare reports that document their investigative work and conclusions. The police station communications center receives emergency calls and coordinates response to incidents throughout the jurisdiction. The communications staff work around the clock to ensure that police, fire, and medical services can respond quickly to emergencies and requests for assistance. Police station holding cells provide temporary detention for people who have been arrested but not yet transported to the county jail. These cells are designed for short-term use and basic security while arrestees await booking procedures or court appearances. Williams reflects on how the various buildings that house the criminal justice system work together to process criminal cases from initial investigation through final resolution. Police stations investigate crimes and arrest suspects. Jails hold defendants during legal proceedings. Courthouses adjudicate guilt or innocence and impose sentences. Each building serves a specific function while contributing to the larger system of criminal justice. The buildings themselves reflect the community's commitment to maintaining order through legal processes rather than private vengeance or arbitrary authority. The architecture and organization of these facilities embody centuries of development in legal and correctional institutions designed to ensure fairness, accountability, and public safety. During busy periods, these buildings fill with the complex human drama of criminal justice investigations. arrests, trials, sentencing, and punishment. But during quiet overnight hours, the buildings exist in potential. They're empty rooms and vacant, corridors waiting for the next day's work to bring them back to life. The institutional spaces of criminal justice preserve the dignity and authority of legal processes while acknowledging the human costs and benefits of maintaining order through formal legal systems. The buildings stand as monuments to the community's decision to resolve conflicts through established procedures rather than through force or chaos. In the quiet hours between the day's proceedings, these buildings hold their institutional memory, the accumulated weight of thousands of cases, millions of decisions, countless hours of human struggle with questions of guilt and innocence, punishment and redemption, justice and mercy. The empty corridors echo with the footsteps of everyone who has sought justice or faced judgment within these walls, preserving the ongoing work of law and order in the patient darkness of institutional spaces, designed to serve the cause of justice. Maple Street runs through one of the city's older residential neighborhoods, where houses built in the 1940s and 1950s still shelter families whose roots extend back multiple generations. The sidewalks are lined with mature oak trees that create a canopy of shade during summer months and drop golden leaves in precise patterns each autumn. Detective Thompson walks this familiar route during community policing rounds, observing how the subtle signs of neighborhood life tell stories that never appear in official crime statistics. The house at 1247 Maple Street bears no outward indication that it was the site of a burglary 3 years ago, when an elderly widow named Eleanor Patterson returned from her weekly grocery shopping to find her front door standing slightly ajar and several rooms showing signs of careful searching. The case had been solved within a week when the perpetrator was arrested attempting to sell Mrs. Patterson's jewelry at a downtown pawn shop. But the impact on her daily life extended far beyond the recovery of stolen property. Why Mrs. Patterson had lived in the house for 47 years, raising 3 children and caring for her husband through his final illness in the upstairs bedroom that overlooked the garden. She had tended with increasing care as arthritis made other activities more difficult. The burglary had violated not just her property, but her sense of safety in the space that contained her most precious memories and represented her independence as an aging woman living alone. The investigation had been routine from a law enforcement perspective, but Thompson remembered the way Mrs. Patterson's hands had trembled as she described discovering the intrusion, how she had stood in her own living room feeling like a stranger in the space where she had celebrated birthdays and holidays, watched her children take their first steps, and mourned her husband's death. The burglar had spent perhaps 20 minutes in her house, but the psychological impact had lasted months. Mrs. Patterson's daughter Margaret had driven over from the next town that same afternoon, her face tight with worry as she assessed the damage and tried to understand how someone could have violated her childhood home. Margaret had stayed for a week, sleeping in her old bedroom and accompanying her mother to the police station for follow-up interviews, both women struggling with the realization that the house they had always considered a sanctuary was vulnerable to intrusion by strangers. The neighborhood had responded with the kind of practical support that emerges in communities where people have known each other for decades. Jim Henderson from next door had installed additional locks and a motion sensor light without being asked. Sarah Chun from across the street had started including Mrs. Patterson in her weekly grocery runs, creating a system of regular contact that provided both practical assistance and emotional reassurance. The burglary had changed the rhythm of daily life on Maple Street in subtle but measurable ways. People began locking doors that had remained unlocked for years, checking on elderly neighbors more frequently, and paying attention to unfamiliar vehicles or strangers walking through the neighborhood. The crime had created a heightened awareness of vulnerability that would influence behavior for years. After the immediate incident was resolved, Mrs. Patterson's son David had driven up from the state capitol the following weekend, spending Saturday morning at the hardware store selecting security devices and Sunday afternoon installing them while his mother watched from the kitchen window, her coffee growing cold as she supervised work that made her feel both safer and sadder about the need for such precautions. The family dynamics had shifted in ways that extended far beyond security concerns. Margaret began calling more frequently. Conversations that started with practical questions about door locks and alarm systems but gradually expanded to include broader discussions about their mother's ability to continue living independently. David found himself thinking about his childhood home during business meetings, distracted by concerns that would have been unimaginable before the burglary forced him to confront his mother's vulnerability. The extended family had gathered for Thanksgiving that year with a new awareness of how fragile their assumptions about safety and stability really were. Cousins who normally talked about work and weather found themselves discussing home security systems and neighborhood watch programs. The grandchildren, too young to understand the details of what had happened, sensed the adult anxiety and responded with unusually clingy behavior during family visits. Thompson pauses in front of the house where the Chun family lives, remembering a domestic violence case from 2 years ago that had required multiple visits before the situation was finally resolved through a combination of legal intervention and family counseling. The case had begun with a neighbor's call about shouting and the sound of breaking glass, but the investigation had revealed a complex pattern of stress, financial pressure, and communication breakdown that had been building for months. The initial police response had been handled with the careful attention that domestic violence cases require, balancing immediate safety concerns with recognition that family conflicts often involve complex emotional and economic factors that cannot be resolved through simple law enforcement intervention. The responding officers had separated the family members, documented evidence of property damage, and ensured that everyone received medical attention for minor injuries. Sarah Chun had been reluctant to cooperate with the investigation initially, torn between fear of her husband's anger and concern about the impact that criminal charges might have on their family's financial stability and their children's sense of security. Her husband worked construction jobs that provided irregular income, and she managed the household budget while caring for their 2 young daughters and her elderly father-in-law, who lived with them. The domestic violence advocate who was called to the scene had spent hours with Sarah, explaining legal options and safety planning, while acknowledging the practical constraints that made leaving the relationship seem impossible. The advocate understood that domestic violence cases often require multiple interventions before victims are ready to take steps that might ensure their long-term safety. The criminal case had been complicated by Sarah's initial reluctance to press charges and her husband's enrollment in an anger management program that demonstrated his recognition that his behavior had been unacceptable. The prosecutor had worked with the family to develop a resolution that included counseling requirements, regular check-ins with probation officers, and a protection order that could be enforced if the violent behavior resumed. The case had eventually been resolved through a plea agreement that required David Chun to complete domestic violence counseling and anger management classes while remaining in the home under court supervision. The arrangement had allowed the family to stay together while ensuring that additional resources were available to help them develop healthier patterns of conflict resolution. Thompson had continued to check on the family periodically for months after the criminal case concluded, observing how they gradually rebuilt trust and developed better communication strategies. Sarah had eventually enrolled in community college classes to develop job skills that would give her more economic independence. While David had found steadier employment that reduced some of the financial stress that had contributed to their conflicts, the children, who had been staying with relatives during the most difficult period, had returned home to find their parents participating in family counseling sessions that included discussions about handling stress and anger in ways that didn't frighten or harm other family members. The girls had needed their own counseling to process the scary experience of seeing their parents in conflict and learning that adults sometimes needed help to solve their problems. The extended family had rallied around the Chuns with a combination of emotional support and practical assistance that helped them through the most difficult months of rebuilding their relationship. Sarah's sister had provided childcare during court appearances and counseling sessions, while David's brother had helped him find construction work that provided more regular income and health insurance benefits. The neighborhood response had been more complex, with some neighbors offering support while others maintained suspicious distance that reflected discomfort with domestic conflict and uncertainty about how to help families working through such difficulties. The incident had sparked conversations about domestic violence that extended far beyond the Chun family, as other neighbors recognized similar warning signs in their own relationships or those of friends and family. Members. Thompson continues her walk past the corner house where the Martinez family had dealt with their teenage son's arrest for vandalism and petty theft, charges that had led to juvenile court proceedings and a community service sentence that became an unexpected turning point in the young man's life. The case had begun when Roberto Martinez was caught spray painting graffiti on a highway overpass, but the investigation had revealed a pattern of minor criminal activity that reflected his struggle to find direction and purpose during a difficult period of adolescence. Roberto's parents had been devastated when they received the call from police, not just because of the immediate legal consequences, but because they had worked so hard to provide their children with opportunities and guidance that they hoped would prevent exactly this kind of trouble. Both parents worked multiple jobs to support the family, and they had sacrificed personal time and financial resources to ensure that their children could participate in sports and academic programs. The juvenile court proceedings had been designed to balance accountability for Roberto's actions with recognition that teenage behavior often reflects developmental factors and environmental pressures that can be addressed through appropriate intervention. The judge had ordered community service, restitution for property damage, and participation in mentoring programs that connected Roberto with positive adult role models. Roberto's community service assignment had involved working with a neighborhood cleanup crew that removed graffiti and litter from public spaces throughout the city. Initially resentful about the court-ordered work, Roberto had gradually developed pride in the visible improvements that resulted from his efforts, and had formed relationships with crew supervisors who became important influences in his life. The mentoring program had connected Roberto with a local businessman who had grown up in similar circumstances and understood the challenges that young people face when trying to navigate between family expectations, peer pressure, and personal ambitions. The mentor had provided guidance about educational opportunities and career planning that helped Roberto develop more constructive goals for his future. Roberto's parents had participated in family counseling sessions that helped them understand how their work schedules and financial stress had affected their ability to provide the supervision and emotional support that their teenage son needed during a critical period of development. The counseling had led to changes in family routines that created more opportunities for meaningful communication and shared activities. The extended family had responded to Roberto's legal troubles with a mixture of disappointment and determination to help him get back on track. Grandparents, aunts, and uncles had increased their involvement in his life, providing additional supervision and guidance while reinforcing the family's values and expectations for his behavior. Roberto's younger sister had been affected by her brother's arrest in ways that became apparent only gradually, as she began worrying that she might also disappoint her parents and struggling with anxiety about her own future choices. The family had sought counseling for her as well, helping her process her fears and develop confidence in her own ability to make good decisions. The neighborhood had watched Roberto's transformation with interest and approval, as he progressed from court-ordered community service to voluntary participation in neighborhood improvement projects. His visible commitment to making amends for his mistakes had earned him respect from community members who had initially been critical of his behavior. Thompson pauses at the small park where children from throughout the neighborhood gather after school, remembering how a playground equipment vandalism case had brought together families who had previously known each other only in passing. The incident had occurred during a particularly hot summer when tension between different groups of teenagers had escalated into petty conflicts that reflected broader social and economic pressures affecting the entire community. Vandalism had been discovered on a Monday morning when parents arriving with their young children found that playground equipment had been damaged with spray paint and that safety surfaces had been contaminated with broken glass and debris. The destruction had affected equipment that the neighborhood association had spent months fundraising to purchase and install, making the crime feel like a direct attack on the community's efforts to provide safe recreational opportunities for children. The investigation had revealed that the vandalism was connected to conflicts between teenagers from different schools who had been gathering in the park during evening hours when it was supposed to be closed. The conflicts reflected broader tensions about territory, status, and group identity that extended far beyond the immediate neighborhood to include dynamics from schools, social media, and family relationships. The community response had evolved from initial anger about the property damage to recognition that the underlying conflicts needed to be addressed through engagement rather than simply increased security or law enforcement. Parents from different backgrounds had begun meeting regularly to discuss how they could work together to provide positive alternatives to the territorial conflicts that had led to the vandalism. The neighborhood association had organized cleanup efforts that brought together families who discovered they shared concerns about providing safe, constructive activities for their children during after-school and summer hours. The cleanup work had led to conversations about organizing structured programs that would give teenagers positive ways to spend time together while contributing to community improvement. Several teenagers who had been peripherally involved in the conflicts had volunteered to help with playground repairs and maintenance, finding that the physical work provided an outlet for energy while creating opportunities to develop relationships with adults who could offer guidance and support. The volunteer work had demonstrated to community members that the young people wanted to contribute positively when given appropriate opportunities. The incident had sparked broader discussions about youth programming and community resources that led to the establishment of after-school tutoring programs, sports leagues, and volunteer opportunities that engage teenagers in constructive activities while building connections across different social and economic groups. Within the neighborhood, Thompson walks past the house where Mrs. Kim lives alone since her husband's death 5 years ago, remembering how a phone scam had nearly convinced her to wire several $1,000s to fraudsters who claimed to be helping her grandson with legal troubles. The case had been prevented only because Mrs. Kim's neighbor happened to overhear part of the phone conversation and recognized it as a common fraud scheme targeting elderly residents. Mrs. Kim had received a call from someone claiming to be a police officer who said that her grandson had been arrested and needed bail money that had to be wired immediately to avoid additional charges. The caller had known enough details about her family to make the story believable, including her grandson's name and the city where he attended college. The emotional manipulation had been sophisticated, with the caller creating a sense of urgency and family emergency that bypassed Mrs. Kim's normal caution about financial transactions. The fraudster had instructed her to go to a specific store to wire money and had told her not to contact her grandson directly because he was not allowed phone calls until the bail was processed. Asterisk. Mrs. Kim's neighbor, Janet Walsh, had been gardening when she heard Mrs. Kim talking loudly on her phone in what sounded like a distressed conversation about her grandson being in jail. Janet had recognized the scenario as similar to scam warnings she had seen in community newsletters and had knocked on Mrs. Kim's door to ask if she could help with the situation. The intervention had prevented Mrs. Kim from losing her savings, but the incident had shaken her confidence in her ability to protect herself from sophisticated fraud schemes that seemed to become more convincing and psychologically manipulative each year. She had felt embarrassed about nearly falling victim to the scam and worried about her vulnerability to future attempts. The police investigation had revealed that the scammers had obtained personal information about Mrs. Kim and her family through sources that remained unclear, though investigators suspected a combination of public records, social media research, and possibly information obtained through previous scams or data breaches. The personal details had made their story convincing enough to overcome normal skepticism. Mrs. Kim's daughter had driven over immediately when she learned about the attempted scam, spending the evening reviewing her mother's financial accounts and discussing safety procedures for handling unexpected phone calls about family emergencies. The daughter had been frightened by how close her mother had come to losing substantial money to fraudsters. The family had implemented new procedures for verifying any emergency calls involving family members, including agreements that Mrs. Kim would always contact her daughter or son-in-law before taking any financial action in response to urgent requests for help. The procedures acknowledged Mrs. Kim's independence while providing safeguards against sophisticated manipulation. The neighborhood response had included informal information, sharing about common scam techniques, and the development of a phone tree system that allowed residents to quickly verify suspicious calls by contacting neighbors who might have received similar attempts. The system built on existing relationships while providing practical protection against fraud schemes. Thompson continues her walk through the neighborhood, observing how each house contains families whose lives have been touched by crime in ways that extend far beyond the immediate incidents documented in police reports. The interconnected nature of community life means that criminal activity affects not just direct victims, but entire networks of family members, neighbors, and friends who provide support, witness consequences, and adapt their own behavior in response to perceived threats. The public school at the end of Maple Street serves children from throughout the neighborhood, creating connections between families who might not otherwise interact regularly. Thompson recalls how a series of bicycle thefts from the school grounds had led to improved security measures and community discussions about teaching children to protect their property while maintaining the sense of trust and openness that makes neighborhoods feel safe and welcoming. The bicycle thefts had occurred over several weeks, with expensive bikes disappearing from areas where students had locked them during school hours. The thefts had been carefully timed to avoid security cameras and had targeted bikes that were both valuable and easily transported, suggesting that the perpetrator understood both school schedules and bicycle security measures. The investigation had eventually identified a teenager from a nearby neighborhood who had been stealing bikes to sell for money to buy drugs. But the case had revealed broader issues about substance abuse, family dysfunction, and economic pressure that extended far beyond simple property crime. The resolution had required coordination between law enforcement, school officials, family court, and substance abuse treatment providers. The school's response had included enhanced security measures and educational programs about property protection, but also expanded counseling services and peer support programs that address the underlying social and emotional factors that sometimes lead young people to make destructive choices. The approach acknowledged that preventing crime requires attention to root causes as well as immediate security concerns. Parents had organized volunteer patrols during school hours and had worked with school officials to create better lighting and security cameras around areas where students typically left their bikes. The security improvements had been funded through a combination of school resources and community fundraising that brought together families with different economic means and social backgrounds. The incident had sparked broader conversations about youth, substance abuse, and family support services that led to the establishment of parent education programs and peer counseling initiatives designed to help families recognize and address problems before they escalate into criminal behavior or serious addiction issues. Thompson reflects on how crime affects communities through complex webs of relationships that extend far beyond the immediate participants in criminal incidents. Family members, neighbors, co-workers, and friends all experience secondary impacts that influence their sense of safety, their daily routines, and their willingness to trust and engage with others in their community. The Neighborhood Watch program that emerged from various security concerns has created opportunities for neighbors to develop relationships while working together to maintain community safety. Monthly meetings provide forums for discussing security concerns, but also for sharing information about community resources and organizing social activities that strengthen the bonds between families. The program participants have learned to balance vigilance about potential threats with recognition that community safety depends more on strong relationships and mutual support than on security technology or law enforcement presence. The watch groups have become vehicles for addressing quality of life issues that affect neighborhood stability and for organizing responses to problems that require collective action. As evening approaches and Thompson completes her community rounds, she observes families gathering for dinner, children playing in yards under the supervision of parents who have adapted their routines to balance freedom with safety, and neighbors checking on each other with the casual regularity that characterizes stable communities. The neighborhood continues its quiet work of raising children, caring for elderly residents, and maintaining the social connections that make urban life manageable and meaningful. The crimes that have occurred in this neighborhood have become part of its history, influencing how residents think about security and community responsibility, but not defining the essential character of a place where people continue to invest in their homes, their relationships, and their shared future. The resilience that communities demonstrate in response to criminal activity reflects the fundamental human capacity to adapt, support each other, and maintain hope even when confronted with evidence of human capacity for causing harm. The stories that never appear in official crime statistics: the neighbor who checks on elderly residents, the parent who volunteers to supervise playground activities, the family that rallies around a member facing legal troubles, represent the quiet heroism that sustains communities through difficult periods and prevents many potential crimes through the simple presence of people who care about each other's welfare. In the soft light of evening, Maple Street settles into the rhythm of family life that has continued for decades, despite periodic disruptions from criminal activity. Children finish homework under the supervision of parents who have learned to balance protection with the freedom necessary for healthy development. Elderly residents maintain their independence while accepting the support that neighbors provide without being asked. Families work through their conflicts with increasing awareness of resources available when problems exceed their ability to solve them alone. Neighborhood holds its accumulated wisdom about crime and safety in the informal networks of communication and support that develop when people commit to staying in one place long enough to understand how their individual welfare depends on the health of the entire community. This wisdom passes between generations through daily examples of how to help neighbors, protect children, and respond to problems with both practical action and compassionate understanding. Asterisk. The police station transforms after midnight. When the last of the day shift, personnel lock their desks and turn over active cases to colleagues who will shepherd investigations through the quiet hours until morning brings renewed activity. The building settles into a different kind of productivity, one measured not by radio calls and emergency responses, but by the methodical work of documentation, analysis, and the careful preparation of cases for prosecution. Sergeant Patricia Reeves has worked the night shift for 12 years, long enough to understand how darkness changes both the nature of police work and the rhythm of criminal investigation. The overnight hours allow time for the detailed report writing that transforms raw information into the formal documentation that will guide legal proceedings months or years in the future. Without the constant interruptions of phone calls and walk-in complaints, there is space for the kind of thorough analysis that complex cases require. The Detective Bureau occupies the second floor of the station, where individual workstations are arranged to provide privacy for confidential phone calls while maintaining the collaborative atmosphere that allows investigators to share information and insights. Each desk contains multiple case files at various stages of completion, their manila folders organized according to priority and deadline rather than alphabetical order or case number sequence. Reeves begins her shift by reviewing the case assignments that have been passed down from day shift supervisors, noting which investigations require immediate attention and which can be advanced through routine follow-up work. The transition between shifts requires careful communication about ongoing activities, witness availability, evidence processing schedules, and court deadlines that cannot be missed without jeopardizing prosecutions. The first file she opens contains the documentation of a residential burglary that occurred 3 days ago, when homeowners returned from vacation to discover that electronics, jewelry, and small appliances had been removed from their house while larger items remained undisturbed. The initial investigation had focused on physical evidence collection and neighborhood canvassing, but the night shift work involves analyzing patterns and connections that might link this crime to others with similar characteristics. The burglary report describes how the perpetrator had entered through a rear window that provided access to the kitchen, then moved systematically through the house, selecting items that were both valuable and portable. The selection process suggested familiarity with electronics and jewelry, as the burglar had consistently chosen newer models and higher quality pieces while ignoring items that might appear valuable but had limited resale potential. Reeves cross-references this case with similar burglaries reported during the past 6 months, looking for patterns in timing, location, entry methods, and target selection that might indicate the work of the same individual or group. The computer database allows her to search by various criteria, but the analysis requires human judgment to identify subtle similarities that might not be obvious from standardized report. Categories. The pattern analysis reveals 3 other burglaries with similar characteristics. All occurred while homeowners were away for extended periods. All involved entry through rear windows. All showed selective targeting of electronics and jewelry. The geographic distribution suggests someone familiar with multiple neighborhoods, but not necessarily a resident of any particular area. The case file includes photographs of tool marks on window frames that show the specific techniques used to gain entry without breaking glass or triggering alarm systems. The consistency of these marks across multiple crime scenes provides strong evidence that the same tools and methods were used. Though identifying the specific individual responsible requires additional investigative work. Reeves prepares a supplemental report that documents the pattern analysis and recommends coordinated investigation of the linked cases. The report will be reviewed by day shift supervisors who can authorize additional resources for surveillance, evidence analysis, and expanded neighborhood canvassing. The night shift work provides the analytical foundation for investigative decisions that will be made during business hours. She moves to another case file that documents a credit card fraud scheme discovered when a bank's automated monitoring system detected unusual spending patterns on multiple customer accounts. The fraudulent charges had been made at various businesses throughout the region, suggesting either that the perpetrator was traveling extensively or that multiple people were involved in using stolen account information. The investigation requires coordination with bank security departments, credit card companies, and law enforcement agencies in other jurisdictions where fraudulent transactions occurred. The night shift work involves preparing documentation for these agencies and analyzing transaction patterns that might reveal how the account information was obtained and how the fraudulent cards were being used. Case file contains detailed records of every fraudulent transaction, including merchant locations, transaction amounts, and timing patterns that might reveal the perpetrator's behavior and preferences. The analysis shows that purchases were made primarily at businesses that sell easily resold merchandise, electronic stores, department stores, and online retailers that ship to temporary addresses. The transaction timing suggests that the fraudulent cards were being used during business hours when transactions were less likely to trigger enhanced verification procedures, and in amounts that would not automatically require additional identification or authorization. The pattern indicates sophisticated understanding of both credit card security measures and retail transaction procedures. Reeves contacts security departments at several banks to verify account information and request additional transaction records that might help identify how the account numbers were initially compromised. These conversations occur during overnight hours when bank security staff are available to handle law enforcement requests without competing with daytime operational demands. Coordination work requires careful documentation of every contact and information request, creating a paper trail that will support court proceedings if the investigation leads to arrests and prosecution. The night shift provides ideal conditions for this administrative work because phone calls to other agencies can be made without interruption and detailed notes can be prepared without competing demands for immediate attention. The evidence processing room in the station basement operates around the clock, with technicians working different shifts to ensure that physical evidence can be analyzed promptly and results can be provided to investigators according to court schedules and case priorities. Reeves visits the evidence room to check on the status of fingerprint analysis, DNA testing, and other technical work that supports ongoing investigations. The evidence room contains hundreds of items from active cases, each one carefully labeled and stored according to strict chain of custody procedures that ensure admissibility in court proceedings. The technicians maintain detailed logs of every person who handles evidence and every test that is performed, creating documentation that will allow prosecutors to verify the integrity of physical evidence during trial proceedings. The night shift evidence work focuses on cases that require extended processing time or specialized analysis that cannot be completed during regular business hours. Fingerprint comparisons are run against regional and national databases that are accessible only during certain hours. DNA samples are prepared for laboratory analysis that may take weeks or months to complete. Reeves reviews the status of evidence from her active cases, noting which items are ready for analysis and which require additional processing before they can be compared with databases or presented in court. The evidence processing schedule affects investigation timelines and must be coordinated with witness availability, court dates, and other factors that determine when cases can be resolved. The communication center operates continuously, handling emergency calls and coordinating police response throughout the jurisdiction. During overnight hours, the call volume decreases, but the complexity of individual incidents often increases, as night shift officers deal with domestic disputes, intoxicated individuals, and other situations that require extended time and specialized skills to resolve. Safely. Reeves monitors radio communications to stay informed about ongoing incidents that might generate additional investigative work or that might be connected to cases she is currently handling. A domestic violence call might produce evidence relevant to an ongoing stalking investigation. A traffic stop might yield information about stolen property or wanted individuals. The night shift allows time for follow-up work that builds stronger cases for prosecution, contacting witnesses who were not available during initial investigations, reviewing surveillance video that requires hours to analyze thoroughly, preparing detailed reports that will guide prosecutorial decisions about charges and plea negotiations. The interview rooms in the station are used less frequently during overnight hours, but when interviews are conducted, they often involve either urgent situations that cannot wait until morning or individuals who are available only during evening hours due to the work schedules or other commitments. The night shift interviews tend to be more thorough and less rushed than those conducted during busy daytime periods. Reeves prepares for an interview with a witness who works second shift at a manufacturing plant and can provide information about suspicious activity he observed near the site of a recent burglary. The witness had been reluctant to take time off work for an interview, so the night shift scheduling accommodates his availability while ensuring that his statement can be properly documented. Interview reveals details about vehicles and individuals that the witness observed during several evenings while walking to his car after work. His regular schedule had allowed him to notice patterns that might not have been obvious to someone passing through the area only occasionally. The information provides new leads for day shift investigators to pursue. The witness statement requires careful documentation because the information he provides will need to be verified through additional investigation and might eventually be presented in court proceedings. The night shift interview allows time for thorough questioning and detailed note-taking that ensures all relevant information is preserved accurately. The station's computer systems provide access to databases that support various aspects of criminal investigation, vehicle registrations, criminal histories, outstanding warrants, and other information that helps identify suspects and build cases for prosecution. The night shift work often involves extensive database searches that would be difficult to complete during busier daytime periods. Reeves runs searches on vehicle information provided by the manufacturing plant witness, checking registrations for cars and trucks that matches descriptions and cross-referencing owner information with criminal histories and current addresses. The database work requires patience and systematic attention to detail, but it often produces information that breaks cases open. The search results reveal several vehicle owners with criminal histories that include property crimes, providing new leads for investigation. The information must be analyzed carefully to determine which individuals deserve immediate attention, and which should be added to the list of potential suspects for future investigation. The filing systems in the Detective Bureau contain case files that span several years of investigation, organized according to status rather than chronological order. Active cases occupy the most accessible filing areas, while cases pending prosecution or appeal are stored in separate sections that allow quick access when courts request additional information. Reeves reviews files from cases that are scheduled for court proceedings during the coming week, ensuring that all necessary documentation is complete and properly organized for prosecutorial review. The preparation work involves verifying that witness statements are included, evidence logs are accurate, and supplemental reports contain all relevant information. The court preparation work requires attention to details that might seem minor, but can affect the outcome of prosecutions, ensuring that dates and times are consistent across different reports, verifying that evidence descriptions match actual items that will be presented in court, confirming that witness contact information is current and accurate. The station library contains reference materials that support investigation and prosecution of various types of crimes, legal codes, procedural manuals, technical resources about evidence analysis, and specialized guides for investigating fraud, domestic violence, property crimes, and other common offenses. The night shift provides time for research that enhances investigators' understanding of complex legal and technical issues. Reeves consults reference materials about credit card fraud investigation, reviewing procedures for obtaining records from financial institutions, and technical information about how fraudulent cards are created and used. The research helps her prepare more effective requests for information from banks and credit card companies and ensures that her investigation covers all relevant aspects of the fraud scheme. The legal research also provides information about recent court decisions that might affect how evidence is collected and presented in fraud cases. Staying current with legal developments is essential for ensuring that investigations produce evidence that will be admissible in court and that prosecution strategies reflect current legal standards. The break room becomes a gathering place during night shift hours when fewer people are in the building and conversations can be more relaxed and extended. Investigators share information about cases, discuss investigative strategies, and provide mutual support during difficult investigations that involve serious crimes or complex legal issues. The informal conversations often produce insights that formal briefings might miss. Connections between cases that become apparent when investigators have time to discuss details, investigative techniques that have proved effective in similar situations, and practical advice about working with witnesses, victims, and suspects in challenging circumstances. Reeves discusses her credit card fraud case with a colleague who has investigated similar schemes, learning about patterns and techniques that might not be documented in formal reports or training materials. The colleague's experience provides practical guidance about which investigative approaches are most likely to produce useful results. The night shift atmosphere encouraged the kind of thorough, contemplative work that builds strong cases for prosecution. Without the constant interruptions and urgent demands that characterize daytime operations, investigators can focus on details, analyze patterns, and prepare documentation that will support successful prosecutions. The administrative work that supports criminal investigation, preparing subpoenas, coordinating with prosecutors, scheduling court appearances, maintaining evidence logs, requires sustained attention to detail that is often difficult to achieve during busy daytime periods. The night shift provides ideal conditions for this essential but time-consuming work. Reeves prepares subpoenas for bank records that will support her fraud investigation, ensuring that the legal language is precise and that the requests cover all relevant accounts and time periods. The subpoena preparation requires careful attention to legal requirements and technical details that affect whether financial institutions will provide complete information. The prosecutor coordination involves preparing case summaries that highlight the strongest evidence and most promising investigative leads, helping prosecutorial staff understand the current status of investigations and make informed decisions about charges and trial strategies. The case summaries require clear writing and careful organization of complex information. The station's evidence storage areas require regular maintenance and inventory work that ensures proper preservation of physical evidence and accurate tracking of items as they move through various stages of analysis and court proceedings. The night shift contributes to this work when fewer people need access to evidence storage areas. Reeves assists with inventory work that verifies the location and condition of evidence from her active cases, ensuring that items are properly stored and that all handling is documented according to chain of custody requirements. The inventory work reveals items that need additional analysis or that are ready for court presentation. The evidence maintenance work also involves coordinating with laboratory facilities that perform specialized analysis, DNA testing, fingerprint comparison, chemical analysis, and other technical procedures that provide scientific evidence for court proceedings. The coordination requires scheduling and documentation that ensures results are available when needed for prosecution. As the night shift progresses through its quiet hours of detailed work, Reeves maintains awareness of the larger context in which her investigations occur. Each case represents not just a specific crime, but a disruption of community life that affects victims, families, and neighborhoods in ways that extend far beyond the immediate incident. The residential burglary case involves a family whose sense of security has been violated by the intrusion into their home. The credit card fraud affects individuals who must spend time and energy repairing damage to their financial records and credit histories. The investigative work aims not just to identify perpetrators, but to restore some measure of justice and closure for people whose lives have been disrupted by criminal activity. The night shift work contributes to prosecutions that will result in accountability for criminal behavior, but it also supports the community's confidence in law enforcement and the legal system. Thorough investigation and careful documentation demonstrate the seriousness with which crimes are taken and the commitment to ensuring that perpetrators face appropriate consequences. The documentation that Reeves prepares during night shift hours will become part of the permanent record of these investigations, preserving evidence and analysis that might be reviewed years later if appeals are filed or if connections emerge to other crimes. The work requires accuracy and completeness that will stand up to scrutiny by defense attorneys, judges, and appellate courts. The station operates continuously, maintaining the community's safety and security through the combined efforts of patrol officers who respond to immediate incidents, and investigators who build cases for prosecution through careful, methodical work. The night shift provides essential continuity that ensures investigations progress steadily toward resolution regardless of when crimes occur or when evidence becomes available. As dawn approaches and the night shift prepares to turn over active cases to day shift colleagues, Reeves organizes her completed work and prepares briefing materials that will guide continued investigation during business hours. The transition between shifts requires clear communication about progress made, leads developed, and next steps recommended for each case. The night shift work has advanced multiple investigations through database analysis, witness interviews, evidence coordination, and administrative tasks that build stronger cases for prosecution. The work represents the steady, careful accumulation of evidence and documentation that transforms raw information about crimes into prosecutable cases that can achieve justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators. The police station settles into the rhythm of day shift operations as officers begin arriving for morning briefings and citizens start calling with new reports and requests for assistance. The building transitions from the contemplative atmosphere of night shift work to the urgent, Demands of immediate response and public service. The case files that were advanced during overnight hours join the flow of active investigations that will receive continued attention from day shift personnel. The work continues its steady progression through the complex process of criminal investigation, prosecution, and resolution that serves both individual victims and the broader community's need for safety and justice out in the quiet moments before full daylight activity begins. The station holds the accumulated work of another night shift reports completed, evidence processed, patterns analyzed, and cases prepared for prosecution. The work continues its patient progression through the institutional machinery of criminal justice, measured not by dramatic moments, but by the steady accumulation of careful, thorough investigation that ensures community safety and individual accountability.